Hello, James.
Hello, Peter.
How are you?
I am fine.
Yeah,
I've just been able to copy the YouTube link. It
yeah,
says so because I'm now distributing this piece to others.
yeah.
Yeah. So
So you have it. It's
have you? Yeah. Okay. So I've got it. Should I check to see whether it is actually live or is that risky? Do you think, Jens?
okay.
You just went. We just lost you slightly.
Yeah, I closed down my YouTube window. I don't know if it's still streaming on.
Yeah, I can. I've just checked it. It is okay.
Good.
And because what I'll do, I will then also close my web browser. You see, so then it will stop.
Yeah, because you will get echo and.
You got it. Okay, so recipients are all correct. Bang.
Could you also send it to Felix?
Oh, yeah. Yep. Let me just. Forward. Felix. And I've got Christina, the student helper, also on the other window. So so I can. So I know she will do that. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, now he has posted it.
Okay. Yeah, excellent. So therefore, all the staff have it.
So.
And the student helper, she's also put it up as well. Okay, I will now close my browser.
And we're still online, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Keep my email open just in case.
Yeah, I have to, let's say, type it in. So. Yeah. No, it's because I have to moderate it afterwards. So. Good.
And
Someone's pinging here. Okay. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Let us see. So. So
QX. The
good.
important things here.
Good, good.
Mm-hmm.
I think yeah, the audience is here.
This is always good.
Good. Log into chat. So, and I will post something. So, good, good. Let us see. And I will not look at myself on the other screen. It's a bit awkward. So, good.
Also with the time delay.
Yeah, it's it's very odd. So it's real time, but not. So yeah, I will see what is good, good. Let's say if you take focus. No, James, I will give you co-authorship.
Mm-hmm.
And so like that.
Yes.
Can you now share your PowerPoint?
Yes. And do you see the slide?
Yeah.
Title slide?
Yeah.
Also Jens?
Yeah, I see it.
Good, excellent.
Yeah, good. It's fine. So so you might stop the share.
Okay, excellent.
Good. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we should be up and running. And it's 8 minutes past 1. And people want coffee also. That's nice. And many people wish you good luck.
Oh, that's very sweet. Thank you.
Yeah. I can't see anything from Alberto yet, but let's see. Yeah, okay. Okay. Yeah, good, good. Yes, good. Works.
Excellent.
Sorry for my hairstyle. I didn't manage to get a haircut.
Before the hairdresser closed.
Yeah, now the hairdresser closed, so I can use that as an excuse. And yeah, to be honest, I'm not happy of going to the hairdressers because I mean it's an awkward situation in my view. So I don't miss it. Let's say that. Good. Okay, 1309. Yeah, I mean we will. Yeah, we have to.
We hold the academic quarter and we start right time at 1:15.
Yep. Good. Yeah. I have my cup of tea. And,
excellent.
Maybe I should go for a glass of water. I'll do that.
Yeah. So. Yeah, it's a bit.
It's interesting waiting.
It's interesting waiting. Yeah, it's different than in the lecture hall. I mean, waiting there. I mean, you can chat with your neighbor and yeah.
Mm.
Oh, another question bumps in.
I've closed my emails so we don't get things
Okay.
pinging in on the way. So
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm forced to have it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So good. Let's see.
And I believe we have Anders Peel from Bornholm. I believe he's following.
Great.
At least Facebook tells me this.
Okay. Yeah.
See, Hill is
I know Anders a bit. We met a couple of times. Is he still working at Bornholm, the museum, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, okay. There are a lot of suggestions rolling into my haircut.
From whom? Staff or students?
No, I'm sorry. Yeah. I have the video option. It says it's a video settings, touch up my appearance. So I have clicked that. So I mean, it can't be better than this. So
no,
yeah.
I think it's just brightness and contrast, and maybe a bit of sharpness.
Yeah.
To take the wrinkles out, so you soften it. So
okay.
So can people see us now? Or they can
see and hear you.
They can see and hear us. Yeah.
So anything you regret saying, you should retract now.
Yeah. Yeah. Should we start? I mean,
have we stable numbers more or less?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Shall we not? Yep.
Yeah, Peter Tree is also on. Christine and Leanne is also. Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, some students come in now. Great. So, yep.
Yeah.
We will start this a bit unorthodox PhD pre-defense, and I will return to James in a minute. But first, I will introduce you to the concept of a pre-defense. So a pre-defense is not a formal defense of the thesis. It is a way how to get some feedback from a qualified person in order to be able to, let's say, still direct the thesis in some directions, or to maybe fill in gaps. So this is a brilliant opportunity to, let's say, improve the final end product. So then I will present you first to our opponent, and I have found his image on the web page. So welcome, Peter. I will give you the option of presenting yourself, and then I will take over again. So Peter, please.
Yes, thank you, Jens. Yeah, my name is Peter Skoglund, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm a lecturer at the Linnaeus University in Kalmar. I have been working with the Bronze Age for many years, and the last 10 years, more particularly with the rock art in southern Scandinavia. Yeah, I think that's you. That's me.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for accepting the invitation. We look very much forward to the discussion, and the structure of today is that James will make a presentation, and then there will be questions and answers, a discussion, an open discussion, a frank discussion between Peter and James. I will not interrupt, so I will leave it up to you two to discuss all the topics that you might find relevant. So a few comments though to our setup today. I mean, it is not because that we suddenly have decided to do this pre-defense via Zoom and to live stream it via YouTube. That was that the last part was a new invention because of the Corona crisis. It was from the beginning that that Peter had the option of coming physically to Aarhus, and because of time constraints, and also to save CO2, Peter then wanted to participate at the pre-defense via this medium. So that was already decided in January. And first, then I will put in an extra slide, because we will the reason for being able to do this is because of the research, the Nordic research network, where one important partner is DIKE, the Danish E-Infrastructure Corporation, the Swedish SUNET, linked together in NordUnet. So so I will welcome to our department, and I will say a few words on the subject matter before I give the word to James. And it's I will just say that rock art isn't let's say art in that sense like this. It is but it is a visual creative expression in a non-literate society, and that is why it defines a pathway into the mindset of peoples from the past. Now, it is carved in rock, which means that it is the most persistent material you can choose. So that's also, in my view, a very important point, that it is an expression, but it is meant to be there for good. Now, James will not go so much into these matters in his presentation, because as an academic, we have to find approaches how to analytically study this rock art. So with these words, I will leave you and give the word to James.
And do we not need to ask Peter to mute his microphone as well?
Okay.
Yeah, just in case there develops any echo, we're okay. Maybe other users could experience that. Okay, I will share the screen. Do you see the slide? Yips. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this pre-defense seminar presentation. It's on the theme of signs, structure, and cryptanalysis. These terms, the diagram and the image on screen now, will all be hopefully become clear during the course of this presentation. And I need to, there we go. So the subject of the presentation is the theory and methodology of my forthcoming PhD dissertation, Transforming Terminology, Dividing Southern Tradition Prehistoric Art, supervised by Jens and also Johan Ling in Göteborg. I will be, the theory and methodology of the thesis really centers around the following key concepts and methods: structuralism and structuralist theory, semiology from the Saussurean perspective, and then using cryptanalysis as a methodology. All of these terms will be defined as we go into depth along the way. And it is hoped that by using these three main concepts, that one could perhaps move towards a workflow for reading, in parentheses, prehistoric art. And Jens has already begun thanking our many people who are helping this to be possible. But I would like to single out, obviously, Aarhus University for the financing of my PhD scholarship, and the Dean thereof for providing the software licenses to enable processing on the National High Performance Computer Abacus, which is part of Dyke, which Jens has given a very good introduction to. Thanks also to Bornholms Museum for assisting with the very significant fieldwork component of the thesis, as well as Underslagsmuseum, Swedish Rock Art Research Archives, and Länsstyrelsen Västergötland for the Swedish components. Länsstyrelsen Västergötland and NTNU Vetenskapsmuseet were also two of my research days abroad, these organizations are here thanked. And I'm going to start somewhat unorthodox, in a somewhat unorthodox manner, by presenting the end, and hopefully by focusing on the end, and giving the audience some idea of the end, it will be a little bit clearer as we proceed along the various waypoints. But the key is that the understanding of meaning of rock art might be furthered by focusing more on relations between these different fragments of evidence. And these can be, as you see on the screen in the little drawings, the archaeological context, the figures themselves, and how they all relate between each other, such as in the diagram on the right. But also things of the natural environment, like the color of the stone. But relations is not just something you see proximally. It can also be between the images themselves. So hence the connection to semiology. I also plan to use cryptanalytical methods to analyze these structures. I believe that some of the methods within this this field have a lot to offer to help us proceed a little bit further than we have hitherto been able to. And I would do so within a workflow. And the two things I want to sort of plant in the reader's mind. In some ways, the further away you move from rock art, the easier it is to study the problem. So this is admittedly a very abstract approach, and we will sort of go off on various tangents, but then also come back again to explain the relevance. But to do so, we may need to think outside the box. And it's hoped that by the end, this will all become clear. So first of all, what are we really dealing with? I want to start with background. The Northern tradition and the Southern tradition. These are, we're dealing with rock art, and the Northern tradition is, you can see some pictures on the upper right, mainly cervids, that is to say elk, deer, but also sea mammals, whales, porpoises, anthropogenic objects such as boats and abstract figures. It can be polished, so like the image I'm circling now. It can be painted, and this one's actually in a cave. But most of it is found on the open air. The Southern tradition is quite different. And here I've just taken one scene which shows many of the key elements. You have these main sign groups and cup marks, ships, boats again, anthropomorphs, once again, foot soles, animals of various kinds, various circle motifs, also artifacts such as we see paddles, but also swords and weapons and other objects, and also abstract figures, or at least they appear abstract because we do not know the meaning. So various terms have existed to describe these two kinds of representation, and these groupings have dominated our understanding. Here on the right, you see the way it is traditionally represented as sort of zones, areas drawn on a map. The terms Northern and Southern tradition themselves were coined by the late Calasognus, as he's felt that the other terms, hunters, farmers, Stone Age, Bronze Age, were too loaded. And indeed, there is much evidence to suggest this is the case, as we will see. But principally, the differences are interpreted as a consequence of subsistence, i.e., Northern tradition, hunter, fishers, gatherers; earlier, Southern tradition, farming and cultivation. And it's important to stress that the dates on screen here are the dates that we believe are attributable to the images, not to the culture, so to say, of hunter-gathering and farming. And the fact that there are some question marks there also begins to give us the indication that not all is well, and that certain things can be questioned. And these assumptions include the distribution, how homogeneous it is, chronology, and how it varies and to what extent. And so to think of this, you can think about the differences in the distribution. You can see on the left and the right two distribution plots of the northern on the left and the southern on the right. And you can see that contrary to the image of where we just drew lines on a map, the art is not equally distributed, and neither is it necessarily all carvings. It is also paintings or polished, as we see in the northern tradition. It is also, so to say, quite varied in terms of when it comes to the southern tradition, the distribution of the different types of images. So these different colors in Nomura's map on the right, which can be criticized for various reasons which we won't go into here, does seem to show that certain kinds of figures, or in this case, combinations of ships and something, or nothing and or something else and no ships, do appear to vary over space. So we can see with the redder colors, ships focusing on the west and east coast of Sweden and up the west coast of Norway, right up towards into the Arctic. We can also see towards the southern part of Sweden, some tendency towards foot soles, and then in Denmark we can see there's a lot of blue dots in Jutland and on Sjælland, suggesting that circle motifs are more prevalent across that area. But that's not the whole story either, which leads me to discuss the four images on the left. You've got different contexts and media, or what I'm calling different contexts and media. So we have them from top left. We have them on glacial erratics. We have them associated with graves. So here on the capstone of a dolmen, and then we can and there are some issues which we'll come to regarding to chronology here, because some recent finds on the island of Bornholm of a small stone with cut marks in a sealed context but datable context indicate that they are already using them before 3000 BC. These stones have been placed in as a fill of a feature, so they are in a secondary context. So when we look at the dolmens which are earlier than that specific context, we can start to see this picture of a very long tradition of use, much longer than has hitherto been understood. Graves, it's not just when it comes to graves, it's not just during the Stone Age. We are very much associated with the Bronze Age. We see bottom left Kivik in Skåne in southern Sweden. But perhaps the most familiar context is the open air, and such as here from Bro Utmark in Tanum on the west coast of Sweden. So just to summarize, so to say, and expand, we already touched on the element of this, if you want to say, what I will call, and somewhat controversially, this misconception of a chronology solely confined to the Bronze Age. This really doesn't seem to hold true anymore with these findings from Bornholm. The situation gets even more complex and perhaps even more blurred when we start to look at some of the results of excavations in Norrköping and also in central and western Norway, which indicate right across the board, in fact, that a lot of the activity is also found with excavation, from excavations, is associated with the pre-Roman Iron Age. Conversely, the counter-argument on Bornholm, excavations at Mesebacher found a line of post holes in front of the panel dating to the Bronze Age. So it's a long chronology, it's fair to say, it seems. Already touched, it's unevenly distributed, and this is quite visibly clear on the map on the right. It's also on, as I said, this concept of media. When I say media, I mean media in the natural environment. Outcrops, stone blocks, big stone blocks. I mean, hundreds of, or thousands, maybe even of tons, some of them. Boulders, and also these small portable stones, things you can just pick up and walk away with. But it's not just the natural environment, it's also the anthropogenic environment. So you said graves, also this discussion about the connection with field systems. In some cases, you could argue the stone could have been moved during the creation of the field system, but on others you could say, well, it's a large stone block, you couldn't move in any way, the ice left it there. There's also a connection to various kinds of water, be it the sea, be it lakes, be it water runs over the panel, or the sound of running water. And generally speaking, the risk of causing all kinds of problems, it is fair to say that the distribution is, broadly speaking, not too far removed from the cultivatable areas. And that is in the sort of agricultural sense here, does not just mean crops and arable. It means also grazing. So, for instance, the upland areas of Western Norway. Okay, so we have some things which maybe are homogeneous and some things which vary. So how might we go about assessing this? Well, at the end of the day, the question all boils down to one of similarity and difference. So this really is the challenge. This is the thing we get a grip with both hands and want to investigate. But even if we find regional variations, we need to think about what are the reasons lying behind them. That's really, otherwise it is just studying something for the sake of studying it. So where are we in this? What could the possible reasons be? Traditional thing might be to say different chronology, different uses of the art in different periods. Maybe different identity. This is possible, possibly linked to chronology. And you can think of different groups using the art in different ways. Or maybe it's all homogeneous and they're all using it in exactly the same way. Then another thought occurred to me, and there is a bit of chance, I think, in this, but then again, nothing is truly random, as we will see. And the thought occurred to me that maybe it could be language, or thinking of it in a similar way to language could be a way of looking at it. Scandinavia, if we look at the world linguistic sense linguistically, from a linguistic perspective, is known for the richness and a number of its dialects and the diversity of those dialects. Whilst they were probably present in other areas of Europe, standardization of the language means that they haven't really made it into, shall we say, the 19th century for people to collect, say, folk songs and such and write it down in standard language. So maybe perhaps this led me towards, well, perhaps these variations in a language model, you could have variation on the one hand, but also similarity on the other. So you can use the same, like we use the same Latin characters in Western Europe for all our languages, but the meaning is obviously very different because they are arranged in different kinds of ways to create different words. But we still need to be mindful of the overarching question, what we are trying to get to, which is, what does the rock art mean? And that really should always be our chief focus. And if this is the case, if there is a possibility to use language, then but it's worth trying at least. It may not be the only explanation, but it's something that we are now, particularly in the modern era, in a position that we can look at once again. So linked to this concept of similarity and difference, I want to sort of just take it right down to basics, to think about what we are really studying, because once you start to think of what one has, then one can move forward. Archaeology can be thought of the study of the past based on partial fragmented evidence. And it's always important to remember that what we find, these findings, whatever they may be, are the result of past outcomes. They are not the cause, so to say. But from observation of the outcomes, one can reason about the underlying truth. And interpretation therefore follows from this that interpretation is a relational concept. So the relations between the findings allow you to find out things about the reasons which might explain these outcomes. These relations, of course, create a structure. And so to illustrate this, rather than me solely talking, I chose to take something we all know quite well, hopefully. Starting with this wonderful bronze and gold gilded object from the National Museum, the Chariot of the Sun. Okay, a disc gilded with gold with various signs and symbols on it, on some kind of vehicle, and a horse. Okay, horse, vehicle, disc. Okay, if we look at the disc, we can see in other contexts we have a disc. We can see that this disc has various kinds of ornamentation. It's in gold. Gold has an association, maybe you might think, with the sun. You have the wheels, a four-spoke wheel system. Okay, this animal is connected to this disc, and this has a cross and circle. There's a cross and circle underneath, which preceded this figure. Okay. But then there's also some other things. What about these three-pronged figures? Okay. But what we can do is we can represent these diagrammatically. And one of the beauties of this, of using mathematical graphs, is that you can exploit the property of the coincidence between mathematical and physical space. So how far away or how close together determines the similarity. So something which is more similar is closer together, and something which is less similar is further apart. Okay. A good way of thinking of this diagram, which I've drawn, which I've calculated from the relations in these 4 pictures, is to think of how many of gravity. So the more connections or relations a given attribute or a given thing has, say the cross and circle, or say the disc, etc., the closer it will be together. And things you get when things occur together, like for example the Chariot of the Sun, the disc, the horse, the wheels, the cross and circle, they have a similar count. It counts up all the number of these shared traits, shared characteristics, and so they end up clustering together in the graph. But what also happens, and which is very useful from an archaeological perspective and many others, of course, is that similar counts end up in certain parts of the graph. So, for example, if we go back to the example of the three-pronged trident figure, this is a specific connotation and a specific count. And this has ended up in the bottom of the graph, whereas the other things centered around the chariot of the sun and the sun horse are further towards the top. So, and this is a property of graphs. When they are not similar, they are opposite each other, so-called orthogonal, as we term it. And this is very important for the determination of similarity and distance, similarity and difference in graphs. So I said that you have the importance of relations, and you can use graphs, and that this is effectively a structuralist approach, or what is called or structuralist. Structuralism can be defined as a field of study envisaged as elements interrelated in systems and structures where relations are considered more significant than the elements in isolation. So this is where our concept of interpretation being something defined by the relations comes from. And it also follows in our archaeological context that the fragments which have been preserved, which have been subject to various kinds of biases in preservation, be they destruction, be they bias in recovery, how people have looked or not looked for certain things, can be studied, and by studying this, we can perhaps move a little closer towards what it is all this is maybe about. So you've got these fragments, which we've met before and earlier. You have the figures themselves, you have their direction, you have how they look, you have their distribution, and that can be both on the panel and on and in the wider landscape and in the sort of regional level. You've got connections with monuments, you've got connections with the natural environment, and this can all be this is all interrelated in various ways. But we must always be mindful that people are behind this, and so yeah, it's important to think about that, to make sure we're not studying something for the sake of studying it. So we get this idea that the figures that we see on the surface can be related in various ways. And you've seen this before, and we will come back to it again towards the end of the presentation, where you can see how there are different kinds of relations, and we talk about them being complex. And so what do we mean by that? That needs to be something which is defined. There are effectively three major types of relations. You can have relations going in a loop, you can have them going both ways, or you can have them going indirectly. So one can understand, for example, with this symbol, this cross and circle, and these cup marks arranged in a circle. You can see this circular cup marks with something in the middle. We can see this cross and circle. One can see how there is effectively an indirect link shown by this dotted arrow between these cup marks and this combination of the cup marks and the cross and circle. There's quite a lot of things which are going on elsewhere in the diagram, but the key takeaway point that I want to sort of stress here is the importance of how you can use these relations to build up diagrams or networks of those relations, and how they can indicate a sequence. Because the key thing, if we're ever gonna sort of learn to read the surface, is is we have to focus on identifying the sequence and the factors which might sort of blur our view of this. And it's for this reason I chose to include this diagram on the right, where you can see how for the same basic distribution, they could be related in all different kinds of ways, and that you can have this concept of direction, and that this direction, like we see on the left and the surface, can allow you to build rules and sort of build up this sequence. And it is very important, and these diagrams will continue to reoccur regularly in this presentation. I mentioned about things which can introduce blur, and the chief of these that we face with rock art, generally speaking, is that is the challenge of time, or what I'm calling the challenge of time. You can have examples which are made all at one time, and they are very valuable for that reason when they're time confined. But in certain examples, and here is an example, is a sort of the most extreme one I could find, if you like, is you can have thousands of years and all kinds of differences separating, for example, this ship, this hand symbol, and then this porpoise. The porpoise is from the northern tradition. The hand sign is probably Bronze Age, we would think, based on other comparisons. And this boat is probably, or at least assumed, to be from the early Roman Iron Age, based on its visual similarity with the Hjortspring find dated to 400 AD from Denmark. And here you can see how, and in the tracing, how you've got these mixes of figures. So this is a challenge, and that one has to address. Here it's relatively easy, but of course, when it comes to more time confined, or where you have panels created over a shorter period of time, this could be particularly problematic. But in any case, what I want to sort of plant in your heads here is the idea of the connection between language and imagery. And I found this quote here from Malmö very interesting, because if we look at ethnographic records, say in Aboriginal Australia, you can take an informant to a site, and if you are allowed to know this knowledge for, and have gone through all the hoops to get that, they would use words to describe that. Now, for them to describe that, they need to know what those images mean. They need to have knowledge. But it also is a property, sort of looking at the problem from the opposite way, that then there has to be some kind of correspondence, deliberate or not, between the layout or the distribution of these signs and the way they relate and the structure of language. Because if you do not have that, essentially the message is only linked to the person who created it. That is a challenge, but again, not insurmountable. And that's not something we necessarily see when we start to look at the rock art in more, the Southern tradition rock art in more detail. This concept of linking language and imagery has been suggested at least once before by Professor Emeritus Jan Nordblad, whom I have borrowed this diagram from. Here he takes this concept that you have two people, a sender and a receiver, able to communicate, and I'll explain what I mean by communicate in a little bit, using the rock art, which is a message. Now, communication merely means the exchange of information. You don't have a little wire or a plug-in jack which connects you to somebody else. You have to have a common language, is a common frame of references whereby you can understand the other person, and you both have knowledge, and you make signs and sounds, and you can communicate. This is also perhaps what we see in the rock art. This would, given what we know from ethnography and what we can perhaps theorize might not be totally unexpected. Which brings us, or at least brought me, to a very interesting proposition, because this concept of a sender and receiver communicating via message, this is a problem that is only really particular to certain branches of science, shall we say. And one of these branches of science is cryptanalysis, which is defined as the study and analysis and decryption of information. And they have archaeology and cryptanalysis are similar in a number of ways. We both have to study fragmentary evidence and try to reason about an unknown. We have to study the outcomes. So therefore we are approaching problems from the opposite direction. It is also necessary, due to the biases in preservation, as I mentioned before, to draw conclusions on the basis of partial evidence. And we also have to manage, we have to take samples and then process those samples, because the information we collect is often subject to various kinds of disturbances. So this is also something a cryptanalyst also has to do. And it's fair to say, epiphany moment occurred at some point in 2018 when I came across this quote. And although it starts with statistics, we could substitute that with the word archaeology or even rock art. Begins by thinking about a fixed underlying truth and the reasons about what events one might observe. But the reasoning can also be reversed. And given an observed set of events, one can try to reason about the underlying truth. We do not know, unfortunately, which wise sage wrote this, but the fact that it comes from the source where that it does should indicate the extent of similarity in the kinds of problems we are trying to solve. And of course, when it comes to rock art, as I said in the previous slide, if we're dealing with communication, it's not like post holes in the ground. It really is language. Language is still at the key, or maybe at the key, or as a key we can use to access the original meaning, or at least part of that original meaning. And so this is something really I have dug down in great depth to, and I'm only going to be able to present to you the key highlights. But here is a wall of faces. And we are going to explore these faces and the ways they are related to one another over the course of this presentation. And sort of, yeah, I mean, really when it comes to structuralism, we're in the Saussurean school. So we have the French, who have to have a bigger flag than anybody else, of course, up in the top right-hand corner. We have the British, of course, at the opposite end, naturally, and the bottom left. And in that sort of L shape on the left, they are all code-breakers, also of certain other nations. We then have the next L along, so to say, in the center here. We have the archaeologists, also from various from Britain and Sweden and France. And then there's another grouping here on the right, who are broadly, we shouldn't look at their nationality too much, but the key thing that links all of them is that they were in New York during the Second World War. And I sort of want to take my sort of our starting point here is really Jan Nodler. You've seen his model, his linguistic model of rock art. He was supervised by a guy called Carl Axel Moberg, who is located just to the left. And he has some interesting connections. But to so to say, to really understand all of these, we have to sort of take a circuitous route. And what we will find is that we sort of have to go in various directions, and maybe you think we're going off in one direction, but then we suddenly, all of a sudden, find we're back where we started. But the key concept, so to say, the starting point of Saussurean, if you like, structuralism and the linguistic view thereof, is this concept of generic language structures. Ferdinand de Saussure, French. He published his very influential work in 1916 on proposing and advocating these generic language structures, which became known as the field of structural linguistics. Now, what do we mean by that? Structural linguistics suggests there are generic general language structures in all language, and all language is the same. And that these are seen in the patterns of syntax, which is order and relation of the elements within language, and in the patterns that we see in language. So frequencies, counts, numbers, and you can see some of these on the image below. But it's important, I've listed here, you see, not just letters. It can also be images. So for example, think of cuneiform or Chinese characters or Japanese characters. They are pictographic writing systems. Now, for me, the key, although Saussure's ideas of signs and reference have been very much criticized, and I do not take these on board, when it comes to generic structures, these have been taken forward. And really, the people that really took this forward were two Americans, William Friedman and Helen Gaines. Because they realized that if there are generic structures, that means language is not random. So, so they published, Gaines and Friedman, two seminal works on frequency analysis in language. And these, maybe they were not the first and all this, but they were read by a lot of people, and very influential. And you see in the bottom this count of different languages, and you can see how they vary just from the colors. But what occurred to me is, if there are parallels between rock art and language, can we not use the same methods that we would in language to find patterns in the images? So that's what started me to think. And then so I started looking more generally at the generic properties of language. So I consulted some colleagues and went looking in the standard textbook and main works on linguistics, and pay particular attention to the sections dealing with generic structures. So there are approximately 6,000 known languages in the world, but the differences are largely on the surface, and observed the variations are similar. And I'd noticed this myself. I mean, I speak several languages, is it 4 or 5 or something. And I've noticed how one can just listen, and one starts to pick things up just by listening. And this is apparently not coincidence, I suddenly found, because even without any knowledge, people can identify certain generic grammatical structures. For example, subjects, objects, nouns, proper nouns, names, places, prepositions, verbs, placement of adjectives. And there are many possibilities to visualize and visualize and analyze these using graphs, these mathematical graphs, which we met earlier. And these, you can look at similarity and then sort of introduce things like conditional probability, but we need to sort of wait a bit before we can take these forward. But I just leave here an example of how it is so pertinent in the present. So if we look at Burkhardt, this section from the National Security Agency's open access publication, The Next Wave, you can see how the different components of the language are highlighted in different colors, and how you can draw links and relations between these. So, research into generic structures, development of structuralist theory. We met this group of people who are on the right of that diagram, who are all located in New York, and there were some very important developments there. Strongly connected to linguistics and structural linguistics, but the key person, and so to say the starting point here in our story, is Claude Shannon. Some of you may know of him, but he's most known for his concept of information theory and for defining such things as the bit. And he came up with this method of communication, which was very widely read. The paper from 1948 was distributed to Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roman Jakobson. Claude Lévi-Strauss, obviously a very well-known anthropologist, then used the same concepts and combined this with Saussurean structuralist theory to propose generic structure of kinship and also myths, so histories about society. And so then you get this idea of a sequence and a linear hierarchy. Closer, so to say, to Shannon's own research is Roman Jakobson. And here you really see the same thing, which is why they're side by side. Sender, message, receiver. You have the information source, the signal, the destination, receiver. But that wasn't Shannon's first iteration, so to say, of the diagram. There was a precursor, originally written in 1940, subsequently published in 1945, and declassified around 1951. Because what was not known is that Shannon was employed at AT&T Bell Labs in Manhattan, a hive of top secret activity and projects, which we can discuss ad infinitum. His research was financed and coordinated by a certain Warren Weaver. And this was under another man called Mr. Vannevar Bush. Okay, let's not beat around the bush, pun intended. Vannevar Bush, he was the head of American research, military research and development prior and during the Second World War. Warren Weaver was one of his, or so we learn in the officially declassified history from the National Security Agency. Weaver was Bush's main fixer and facilitator, and it was Weaver who sent Shannon's papers to Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roman Jakobson and got them to start collaborating with each other. These Lévi-Strauss and Jakobson were in this École Haute Études, this French educational establishment set up by the Free French government in New York, which we will meet many times in future slides. And And they then went to AT&T Bell Labs and saw all kinds of things, which would be secure telephones and all that kind of thing. Now, closely linked to this sender and message receiver model is the concept of what's called traffic analysis in cryptanalysis. Now, it's a methodology used in signals intelligence, which is exactly what it says on the tin, to find out information without needing to know anything about what the message, encrypted message, might contain. Friedman, who we've met before, was very influential and gave a number of lectures, educated many people, and wrote, amongst other things, this manual, which was classified until 2013, but very widely read. Now, it's not just about drawing networks and places on a map. No, you can do a lot more of that. You can use it to guide your sampling strategy. You can use it to help you sort and filter data, to find that specific thing of interest. And of course, it's then very useful also for keeping a hold of time. And of course, time, as we've said, is a real problem we have to address in rock art. Locations, yes, we mentioned that. The metadata, the little codes and little signs which tell how the message is routed, or certain things of this is how you read it in cryptanalysis. It's the key, but in rock art it might be, okay, it's this sign and we mean this. And all different kinds of properties and characteristics about messages, all without having to know what that message actually contains. In subsequent iterations, it's then had very strong links to graph theory, but we have to wait before we can release that. As we all know, the Americans love to say they were the first in many things, but they were not the first, because it would seem that one side of the story is completely missing. GC and CS, the Government Code and Cipher School, now GCHQ, were doing this for many years, during the First World War, between the wars, and long after. The files are still classified, and for this reason, I've had to, in my chapter, if you leave it there, withheld under Section 3.4 of the Public Records Act 1958. All we have are snippets. And one of these snippets, which comes from one of these closed files, is the photograph upper right. And this shows the structure of German military communications, and it was the absolute first of its kind in the world. Many people, of course, contributed to this, but one of the key instigators was this chap on the lower right, Gordon Welchman. And he gives us more, he gave us, so to say, more clues than we would otherwise have, because he published in 1982 an unauthorized account, and this attracted enormous controversy and nearly landed him in prison, and all kinds of legal problems. But the information, nevertheless, which we do know about, is still really useful. But I think when it comes to this, we have to be aware there is information out there which we do not know and cannot know, and if we did know it, I wouldn't be allowed to say it to you anyway. But, okay, send a message receiver. But I want to just backtrack slightly to the USA, because there are two really important concepts which I think have great potential in rock art studies, which Claude Shannon wrote about. This concept of entropy and redundancy. Now, entropy means you don't actually read everything. And you only need to read so much before you can understand something, and it links to all different kinds of applications about predicting things and probability, but we will leave those aside. So consider the following example where, and then there's a key stream. Okay. Perhaps it's a bit easier to understand if I add the spaces in. And what I've actually done is remove all the vowels from the sentence. And when you read the plain text at the bottom and then look back through, you should be able to see how actually you could probably, by phonetically reading the various lines, you can access that, that meaning. And that's what entropy is. It also is strongly linked to the concept of redundancy. So in other words, how many letters do you have to remove before it becomes unintelligible gibberish? Or conversely, how many letters do you need before you can understand it? So when we think about weathering and rock art, so the physical breakdown of the surface due to natural processes, this will be very important because we know this is a major factor affecting the data. Because it allows you to fill in the gaps, so to say. And it can explain many different kinds of phenomena, as I say, also frequency. And it's very important in automatic information processing. And this is something which we're going to grow and develop as we go along. But now I think it's time to sort of take something completely different. You know, the French contribution in all this seems to have been completely overlooked, both in terms of cryptographic history and in terms of archaeological applications. Now, at this point, yeah, okay, it's beginning to get a little late, but if we were in France, we would all stand up and sing with gusto the Marseillaise, and then clear off for a long lunch, which we would emerge worse for wear some 2 hours later. Unfortunately, you're not going to get off so lightly. In this regard to the French, and there have been a number of new insights from new evidence, principally from the declassification of private papers of Gustave Bertrand, who was the head of French signals intelligence prior, during, and after the Second World War. He is linked to a certain Pole named Henryk Zagalski, who's very important in our story. He also, then there's this sort of, another sort of curveball. There's this other person called Henri Séric, who also knows a certain person called Jean-Claude Gardin. And all of these people and their roles will all be explained in due course. Henri Séric is a de Gaullist. He was a prominent member of the Free French government in exile. And that's why de Gaulle's picture is sitting there with his arms crossed, obviously about to say no to something. But there are key links between the French and Polish and French code-breakers, because Gustave Bertrand, as you will see, had various kinds of connections. And here they are. So, as I said, he was head of French signals intelligence, and during the 1930s, they start collaborating with the Poles. We won't go into why it's not relevant for this particular part of the story. The Pole, Marian Rejewski, solves the wiring of the Enigma machine, which is a mechanical cipher machine shown lower right. And the key problem was, how is it all wired up? Because if you know the wiring, then you can try and find the settings which would produce these outcomes. His colleague, Henryk Zagalski, who is shown in bold due to the critical importance of his contribution, exploited the coincidence of mathematical and physical space, what we talked about in graph theory earlier in the presentation, to create the Zagalski sheets. And these, yeah, we will see them in a little bit. The Poles constructed the first bomb. We know about the bomb, maybe from all the films and all that, but the Poles were the first. As I say, we can think again about these graphs and how the sun horse all relates to it, etc., etc. And you see the Zagalski sheets, and those little dots you can see on the screen, that's where light's shining through. And that square of card in the middle corresponds to the third rotor of the enigma. And all those dots which shine through, those are the possible combinations. So all they had to do once they'd aligned all these up was just test for those rather than the billions of billions of billions. The Poles evacuated to France after Poland was invaded and almost unbelievably continue cryptanalytic activities in Vichy-occupied France. The extent of these was not known until 2015, when it was revealed that they were even able to correspond and exchange material with Bletchley Park and also the Americans. Eventually that had to be closed and the Poles fled to Bletchley Park, who of course were, as many of you will know, were in progress with their own activities. And so, yeah, so here it's time to introduce you to the British camp, or shall we say the absolute complex. Here are colleagues at Google, who apparently, according to Jens, are whose data center is processing this and who have stolen their 3D view from, is of Bletchley Park. And you can see the modern buildings around delineating the site, but all that, see those blocks, those complexes and the car parks, they were all centers of cryptanalysis, as well as the main original buildings. Much has been written, much has already been known, but I want to bring just a few highlights to your attention, the magnitude of some of the developments which took place there. The design and construction of the world's first programmable computer, not semi-programmable, but programmable. It was programmable when Sean Wiley and Donald Mickey, on a Saturday afternoon, with nothing better to do after the end of the war, decided to punch up a program and run it, thereby effectively creating the first program run on a computer ever. The development and first practical application of Bayesian statistics. Many of you listening to this will use Bayesian statistics on a daily basis in your work. This term was first coined in the English language by Jack Good, but was invented, so to say, in secret and classified by Alan Turing and implemented in devices such as the bomb, development of the Polish bomb, and Colossus Mark II, which you see on the upper right. It also sowed the seeds in Donald Mickey, Jack Good, and Alan Turing, the development of the field of machine or artificial intelligence as we know it today. Sean Wiley and Bill Tutt also were pivotal in advances in graph theory. Sean Wiley took his doctorate in topology, which is the study of structures which do not change shape over space and time, which has affected what those mathematical graphs are. Bill Tutt effectively found ways and started to create mathematical algorithms to draw the graphs like I showed you earlier. And lastly, we wouldn't know anything about this if it weren't for this guy, Brian Randall from Newcastle University, computer scientist and computer historian, who in slightly prompted by Donald Mickey, who was prepared to say more than he really should have, kept digging and eventually led to this secret being revealed around 1970, which is when these key developments in archaeology also occur. Okay, that's the French. That's the British. Now, what about the French? Henri Seyrig, he seems to be a key person, and this is still quite under investigation. Archaeologist, married to Ferdinand de Saussure's daughter, so this is maybe where so there's some exposure to structuralism. Director General of Antiquities in Syria and Lebanon, which were under French control before the war, and director of the French Institute of Archaeology in Beirut, Lebanon. He was also a prominent member of the Free French. And this picture, in fact, is taken during his meeting with Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French. And the Free French government in exile appoints Seyrig cultural attaché in Washington, but based in New York. In 1942, he moves to New York and becomes professor at l'École Libre des Hautes Études where a certain Claude Lévi-Strauss, who he finds and employs and as a member of staff there, and Roman Jakobson are also teaching. So you have Seelig, who gets Lévi-Strauss and Jakobson into this school, which is set up for by the Free French government in exile in New York. And why is Claude Rains sitting here? Well, from now on, it really is a case, as he says, of rounding up the usual suspects. And this is going to be a theme which occurs repeatedly in the remainder of this presentation as we move towards, slowly, but we move towards the conclusion. Because, of course, we know all this about Shannon and all the links with the National Security Agency, or what will become that. Okay, but maybe somewhere in America, we're working and investigating whether he saw punched card information retrieval systems, and we'll show some punch cards later what they are if you don't know what those are. But he may have seen this. What we can tell you is that you couldn't practically get any punch card equipment because the NSA were using it to sort and archive Japanese and German signals. Later after the war, it's also worthy of mention, also in the round up the usual suspects connection, André Seelig's membership of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, where we have such members as, well, one person you haven't yet met, but Alan Turing, and also two that you won't met, but you can just Google if you want to see them plastered over the front pages of the BBC as recently as 2 months ago, Boris Hagelin and William Friedman, who we have seen. And post-war, in any case, André Seelig meets a certain person, Jean-Claude Gardin, who is very important to our story. There are many superlatives about that one can, and firsts which one can attribute to Jean-Claude Gardin. Pioneer of archaeological computing, one of the world leaders in the development of scientific information systems and documentary language. And we had in a recent pre-defense of Johan Larsen, what has archaeology contributed to uniquely to science? Well, this is one, you could say, because he was approached, as we will see, by Euratom. He was approached and made some advances, which we'll come to. But a lot of what he worked with, just to sort of hold you here, was with codes, and with this idea that you can sort of code up or break things down into their smallest pieces and build them up again, and use that to index your data. Codes are merely something which stand for something else, and where a phrase or symbol, a word or phrase is replaced with an arbitrary symbol. And it can also be an image. Rock art, I mean, this is a caveat here, is probably a co-group system, but we have to take that in the discussion, I think. Gardin is an enigma. I mean, as one of his leading biographers said, it's very difficult to find anything about his past, and he's very discreet about it. But what we can tell you is that he serves aboard this destroyer in the Free French Navy, Le Combattant, which is sort of legendary status in French culture, because there's always been a Le Combattant in the French Navy since it's existed. So it's sort of like the mascot, if you like. He attains the rank of ensign after having enlisted early at the age of 15. He's demobbed, and maybe he draws on his Free French collections later in life. At least this is the hypothesis. And perhaps this is how he ends up being posted to Beirut. But there's this mysterious post-war gap in his career. So between the end of the war, we don't really know what he does. Apparently he takes a diploma in economics at the LSE and studies linguistics and history of religions at the Sorbonne. So this is where he is introduced to linguistic structures and the like. Begins his career as an archaeologist digging in Afghanistan. And so this is how it starts. And then suddenly we come to the riddle of the 4 codes, or shall we say, the first of our problems. In Afghanistan, he decides to leave archaeology as he finds it boring. But his supervisor, Serig, encourages him to look into information recording and retrieval systems. And this leads to this groundbreaking article, 4 codes and descriptions of artifacts. Not only does it introduce semiology and semiotics, and we'll see that methodology later, it introduces also the beginnings of automatic information processing and data storage and retrieval using these punch cards. And here we can see punch cards. I do believe, if I'm correct in thinking, in the IBM format. And the principle is exactly the same as the Zygalski sheets, which were, in the words of Jack Good in speaking 1992, you couldn't talk about them in the UK at this time when he wrote. They were classified. If you wrote about them, some officials would visit you and you would be politely asked, inverted commas, to remove your paper from publication. In this 4 codes, there are very scant references. I mean, how he comes up with this, because it's just so direct and so to the point. Except the only reference is to a 1953 issue of American Documentation with references to the usual suspects, which is why Claude Rains is once again on screen here, because they include Vannevar Bush, all the people holding the patents for the IBM punch card systems and their rivals, who of course, as we've already explained, are all providing by the bucketful all their resources. They can hardly keep up with the demand from the NSA. So this work with these 4 codes attracts the attention of the European, eventually the European Atomic Energy Commission. Before this, though, he sets up this Center for Analysis of Documentation in Archaeology, or CADA. Levi-Strauss is on the board. And then he gets this approach because they think it's so interesting what he's doing. I mean, we don't quite know why they chose him or how they came about it, but you can sort of work it out for yourself. And he creates this meta language for them. He gains access to early powerful computers. And then sort of, goes off in this, along this, and we'll come back to that. But I want to just focus here briefly on why is meta language so crucial? And it's hard to underestimate and the importance, because it's so important in what we call now artificial intelligence, but it was called then machine intelligence. By using meta language, you can break something down into its simplest constituents. And when you can do that, that is the preconception for automatic processing. And here I quote Jack Good, who is really quoting Turing, but of course he committed suicide by this point, of course. That from Turing's big idea in the war, which was secret, of course, was from a logical contradiction, you can deduce anything. And that is at the essence of modern computing, artificial intelligence, the lot. I mean, yeah, case closed, so to say. To go back to Gardan's principles of arrangement, okay, so we can think of this sort of as a visual meta language. So he's trying to break it down into the simplest components, or the basic components, and this is user defined, and then build them up, which is why you've got these sort of arrows linking one level to another level. And then this sort of, here it's in this connection that that Gardan starts to get interested in semiology, study of the meaning of signs. And then he starts to, this is not enough for him. He then starts to look at how they're built up, and he gives a long description in his article. But here I've actually drawn them in a graph, in a directional graph. So he classifies the sort of relations into different classes of syntax, how the figures are, how the images are arranged, and then various what he calls topographical connections, so how they're placed relative to one another. And not all of them can link to each other. And this is the point where I've sort of added my own interpretation, particularly in light of rock art. And so you get this idea, as Andreasen and Messen have in their diagram at the bottom, where you've got this series of connections going not all over the place, but actually a certain sequence. So you have connections, but a sequence. And this is also fundamental in artificial intelligence, because it allows you to create rules. And this is something we, in terms of looking at the arrangements, I mean, although it's not as formalized at this, and I'm looking to sort of move more in that direction, Jan Noblar also independently, or at least certainly observed these similar kinds of basic properties about direction, clustering, and arrangements of figures. And this is really, I think, where the structure is and where we should start moving. But to sort of really try and round this off with Gardin, because I think there's a lot more we can potentially learn, maybe in the archives, maybe in future releases. You know, and there is the question: is he basically a member of the French intelligence or something else? We don't know. We have many indications he's in the right place at the right time, but we don't know. So then we come to the curious case of what I'm calling Jean-Claude Gardin and the Cappadocian tablets, which are written during the Anatolian Bronze Age in cuneiform. Okay, fine. But what Gardin does with this is just so out the box. I mean, I've told you that they were working with graph theory at Bletchley Park, and the people who were there would then go on to do that and be world leaders in that. But Gardin goes to the next level, basically group detection, which is really quite advanced. And he starts this in 1961 using graph theory and computers to map this merchant network. And he creates a meta language, so he's combining his work with Syntol, and then sort of looks at the spatial distribution. Basically, he draws a network, which is just the same as doing a traffic analysis, like a radio net. It's just people writing on clay tablets instead of sending signals. Through this, he gains access to a powerful early computer, an IBM 650. Not only that, a computer programmer, a mathematician to develop an algorithm, but description of this algorithm and all papers pertaining to this work are indexed but are seemingly missing in the Gardin archive. And a guy called Sebastian Plutniak has looked into this in more detail, and this is clearly something to follow up. The only thing he could find was an incomplete description on a flimsy 2-page unpublished working paper, which still leaves the key detail to the imagination. Now, what is the, as I said, I sort of hinted away that it's the same as a traffic analysis, but it goes beyond that, the problem. Because if you can automatically detect groups, it's one thing for you and I to draw groups with circles and red pencils. It's another thing to do it automatically. Because this is really, you know, monitoring people and communications. They do, I mean, now if we sort of zoom forward to the present day, the fact that this clique detection shown bottom right is the key thing that the NSA are highlighting in their journal just illustrates how up to date it is. And of course, now with Corona, what they are doing, of course, is they are, or at least we hope, they are using the modeling of groups and how things can spread and different communication networks. I mean, they shouldn't monitor where our phones are, but of course you could, and who's been infected and such like. And I've already mentioned, Bill Tutt and Sean Wiley's contribution. Bill Tutt left, as far as we know, signals intelligence, but Sean Wiley continued and was chief GCHQ senior mathematician between the years of, if I remember correctly, 1958 and 1972. And I think when we look at his background in topology, the basis of ground theory, that's why he was perhaps appointed to that position. But back to the 1970s, the only people working with automatic processing at this time were Edinburgh University. Which brings us to these guys and a certain James Doran. Doran and Hodson published this this mathematics and computers in archaeology, which really sort of puts both fields sort of on the roadmap, so to say. And they start by focusing on the coincidence of mathematical and physical space, and start to discuss randomness, stress importance of relations, and focus on using graph theory. Doran takes these forward in automatic processing and the first early applications using computers. And the professor at Edinburgh at this time, and his inspiration, which you can all read, by the way, for yourself on the internet, is none other than, round up the usual suspects, a certain Donald Mickey, who is here speaking to Channel 4 in the excellent series Station X. Donald Mickey founded the journal Machine Intelligence and is generally recognized as one of its pioneers. Although the work began in the war, he's the first, so to say, public pioneer. And he worked closely with Jack Good. But he was also, as we've said, he was also in this just earlier in the 1970s, talking to Brian Randall and spilling all the beans about the ultra secret, which led to, well, which is why it's known today, frankly. But all this suddenly brings us in our roundup of the usual suspects back to where we started. Carl Axel Moberg, who is a close friend and collaborator of Jean-Claude Gardin, closely and collaborates with James Doran and likes Edinburgh University. You even read and commented on sections of Doran and Hodgson's work, and was also Yad Noblar's doctoral supervisor. And yeah, so a short biography on him. He was, his father was professor of Oriental languages at Lund. He was professor of archaeology at Göteborg, director of Gothenburg Archaeological Museum, and placed great emphasis on communication. And communicating archaeology to the public. But he was also interested in not just his own subject in the early Iron Age, but also archaeological method and theory, and was a big advocate of what we would call structural finds analysis. And we'll talk more about that now, or at least shortly. But he also made some very interesting comments on rock art. P.V. Globe publishes his seminal catalogue, Rock Carvings in Denmark, in 1969. Moberg is asked to review this because he bridges, he's asked to review this, and he's in this unique position because he bridges the world of Gardin and semiology and semiotics. And we would say semiology is, yeah, well, semiology, semiotics, and the quantitative world of Doran and Hodson. He reviews the publication in Kumul in 1970 and writes, the less rock art research is concerned only with rock art research, the better. It reads much better in Swedish, but and colleagues write, I can't understand why. I don't understand it. I mean, okay. He then, not only that, then proceeds, of all the things he could discuss, says, I don't really quite believe in these assumptions about the North and Southern tradition. Wasn't called that then, but that's what he means. advocates the studies of relationships between the signs, which are taken up by really, well, no one except Jarl Nordblad, who studies combinations and sequences. Now, this is very rough and ready and work in progress, and due to Corona, I haven't quite managed to get the rescan some of these to make them better, but as we've been booted out of our offices. But so that proviso, what Nordblad found when he compared the combinations and the various numbers of the different kinds of combinations between the main sign categories, that they were basically the same in Bohuslän and Uppland, in Western Eastern Sweden. But we all know, or at least rock art researchers, we all know that we can see differences, subtle differences sometimes. So maybe you got the same group of signs, just used differently. And what was interesting is that another scholar, Hauptmann Wahlgren, without apparently referencing or having read Nordblad's work, or at least she doesn't reference it, comes to exactly the same conclusion, which is, my friends, a top-heavy distribution. And you remember me saying earlier, the working hypothesis, I think, is that rock art is likely to be what's called a code group system. Now, when you have different letters, you have all different, it's like the Alps, you have all different kind of peaks. But with a code group, you have a top heavy or bottom heavy. About only 30% of the possible combinations are used. And this is just what we see. And that's why we have this sort of, I don't know, communist shaped radio tower, or whatever we want to call it. But of course, this is exactly one of the things you can do in the traffic analysis. And this is, although they didn't realize it, either of them, and indeed, Jarl Nordblad has said to me, I couldn't collect an arm to a leg. I failed. Well, no, you didn't fail, because what it shows us is when we compare, done a rough comparison of the two areas, basically using the same categories, but any differences are, so to say, local. So maybe you could have the same language, but then something, different meanings and slight differences in usage. As I said, Moberg focused on structural find analysis and published this influential, influential at least for some, and for me, published, sorry, it was not published, I should say, as it was only distributed as handouts, which were then duplicated and bound and then distributed to a few people and institutions. They were influential, as I said. One of them was Jarl Nordblad, and he took it in the direction he did. Another one is our wonderful host of this seminar, a certain Jens Andreasen, and now myself. But the thing with structural find analysis is the same as with encrypt analysis. From observation of the outcomes, we can reason about the underlying truth. And what I think is what we can sort of sum this all up, Moberg's take on all this, is he combines and embraces Gardan's understanding of structuralism, and yes, also semiology when we look at the rock art. He really strongly reiterates Gardan's ways of formalizing archaeological information, and then really goes towards graphs and coincidence of mathematical and physical space. In the process, also touching on some very advanced concepts, but I will, due to time, not discuss those. So he basically has he has a very interesting way of presenting all this, placing great emphasis on problem formulation, comparing your finds, and then visualizing them. And I've summarized these as sort of key takeaways, which of course we've got to have now because we can't go to a restaurant. Structures are always present. They're in the preserved evidence due to the way it's been formed through archaeological formation processes, but also as a consequence of the selections you, the researcher, make. You have to arrange those findings to make those structures visible. And you add or can add or subtract data which is adding or which will help you answer your problem, and sideline or remove data which is distracting, so to say, your study of the problem, say information from a very different period. And he suggests you do this using mathematical graphs, hence the image of the Jacquard coefficient there. But I think he also makes a really interesting point, which we can take away in this, or I take away in this study. It's not about how much data you have, but about how you use it. So by working and really thinking about what you study, you can do a lot. It's not all about big studies and big data sets. He also makes, Carl Axel, some very mysterious comments. And when he talks about problems, he says, if you have a problem, it depends on whether archaeology might help you with it. But he also says, if you don't have a problem, go and do something else. But the key thing is, there are certain situations where archaeology might not help you. And then he makes this comment here. Structure analysis is very much of a four-letter science. Very strange. But I don't think anybody, I'm almost certain nobody in that audience had any idea, at least at that time, what he meant. But we can now reveal maybe the beginnings of what that was. What is not very widely known is that he worked for the Swedish National Defense Radio Establishment, Swedish Signal Intelligence. He wrote his PhD in German, and presumably when he worked in the FRA between 1941 and 47, during the war years, he may have looked at using what's called using his knowledge of German to spot patterns in the ciphertext. Some colleagues knew, at least he was in the FRA, but what they didn't know, as he didn't discuss his work, was just what he was involved with. There are many people who were, shall we say, merely, so to say, nothing more than secretaries, but he was not that. We know he is, from his position in the FR, listed in one of his obituaries, he's one of the scientific personnel. There are only 30 of those. During the war, Sweden managed to cryptanalyze one of the most advanced teleprinter, online teleprinter. That means that it types out the message and decodes it and encodes it simultaneously. One of the most advanced cipher machines in use at that time, and one which formed the basis of many machines used right up until, believe it or not, 2015. Where this all started was that this paragraph here in the major reference work and the only authorized reference work which has been published by Beckman, where it mentions how Carl Axel Moberg was involved in the construction of these underground offices at the headquarters of the FRA when they moved it to Lovån near Lake Mälaren. But this Arne Berling, he was an amazing mathematician, and he broke this cipher machine, the Siemens and Halske T52. He did it with a pencil and paper, and he did it because there are, quote, although the details we don't know exactly, he never told, or at least not officially, there are only so many ways you can manipulate a bit. Effectively, he found there were only 4 outcomes, and you could predict them very easily and reduce them down to just the right solution. This machine, you see, was on the title slide and is here produced here. And apparently none of this variant, the most advanced variant and the one which formed the basis of machines which were used by the Dutch and the Norwegians, also I do believe in East Germany for a number of years. It apparently didn't exist until it turned up in an exhibition in London last year. But perhaps we can now see, in light of this, what Moberg might have meant by this comment of a four-letter science, which still resounds today. And I say it in the thesis, but I don't think it's necessarily for the public to know exactly what those consequences might be. But one of the things that I've sort of want to conclude this with Carl Axel is that he was described as very lonely in his work. People didn't understand him. But I think this, as he couldn't speak, and he died really, he died before Gordon Welchman's book, The Hut 6 Story, which really lifted a lid on a lot of these things, was published. This may have contributed to his feeling of intellectual isolation. But of course, if Gardan and people, if he knew Gardan had connections with signals intelligence, and if he knew about Mickey, perhaps he, although he couldn't talk about it, he knew that they knew what was going on, because they all knew what they were all doing in the various agencies. As Jens said, I won't be going into the detail of how I would implement a workflow, but you have to take this information and the sort of the key, and I just want to focus on the structure of rock art and data. Rock art is so special because as Gardan pointed out, and which was reiterated by Gallet, that you've got these different levels of meaning, and rock art can connect all of them, and that is something other data cannot really do in the same way. So the data, if you like, the raw, the lowest level are the 3D models, your documentation, your textual description. Then you have your questions, and you use this question to select and classify certain information which you pull out of that data and which you then analyze. And my suggestion is that we could use techniques from traffic analysis to find the writing direction, or the sequence at least, and various other syntactic structures, and maybe eventually to go towards not decryption in the sense of, James gave a seminar today, but in the sense of this is the subject and this is going around this, and maybe this is something related to this, and that's our outcome. So it's hopefully now become clear through all this sort of long and twisting turns that how we can further the meaning of rock art by studying relations and by using the concepts of semiology. And semiology is really a francophone, a term anchored in the francophone academic sphere, but one which perhaps could be made more anglophone in future. I've also hopefully shown how archaeologists have used cryptanalysis to analyze structures, and made some suggestions about how we might go about doing that in rock art. Of course, the idea is to work towards a workflow, implementing all these concepts. And if you want to see a preview, then we can take that in a short while. But perhaps, hopefully now, it begins to become clearer that why I sort of paraphrase Carl Axel Moberg by saying the further you move from rock art, the easier the problem is to study. Because when you look at the problems we face and say the security services the world face now, ours are frankly in archaeology and rock art relatively easy. But we may need to think outside the box. And it's here I'm going to quote Dilly Knox, who was on the Wall of Faces, but has hitherto not been mentioned. And he was a Lewis Carroll addict. And I think what he said about code breaking was, or a little test he used to give, is really interesting to bear in mind when considering rock art. He used to ask recruits, which way do the hands on a clock go round? And of course, most of you have probably already answered, well, clockwise. And he used to respond, no, they don't. Not if you're the clock. And I think that really, once you sort of understand that, thinking about things from the opposite way around, I think then we can begin to really make advances in something like the syntax on Mesobac, as I have attempted here. But just to finish, as a parting shot, I want you to think about the logo of this university and its motto, seeking truth in the depths. If we take Knox's idea, a way of thinking, perhaps in the Bronze Age, it would have looked a bit, this scene would have looked a little different. Perhaps something like this. And as you can see, if we look at this, we have the logo, this abstracted pair of letters and the figures sailing around. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you for your half an hour presentation, which was 1 hour and 40 minutes.
Yes, sorry.
Now, I mean, if we had been in the lecture hall, I would have, let's say, interrupted you. But since we are in this odd situation, I thought, okay, let him go, because people can just stop the stream and go for a cup of coffee and go back again and continue. So I mean, no harm done, except for me and Peter, who had to stay here where we are. So, but okay, I mean, yeah. So the procedure should be right now that we should have comments or discussion between you and Peter. Are you up for that, or do you want a break, or?
No, I think the best thing is just to continue. I think I can do that without a break just now, at least. I guess people are. It's an odd situation. I'm not aware of how many that are following us. Is there a great public out there?
I mean, we are down on 20. We have been 40, so half of the audience has at least left now. But I mean, this will also be recorded, so your discussion isn't, let's say, undocumented. So it will just continue in the stream, if that's okay for you.
Yeah. Okay, but yeah, I have read your text carefully, the chapter 3, and I have a couple of issues I want to discuss with you, James.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I will do like that. I take it from the beginning, and we go through the text, the 50 pages. And I will end with a conclusion or some guidelines, or what I think you should consider when you move forward in your work. And I see my role here today as hopefully helping you improving this chapter. And I think there is, you have probably spotted something there with the cryptanalysis and so on, but there are some more work needed, I think, to make it work. So yeah, let's start. I think even though you have been talking a lot about crypto analyzing, I would like to maybe ask a very simple question, and because on page 2 you write about that it should be possible to crypto analyze the meaning of sudden rock art tradition, using the same and similar kinds of methods as those developed for language. I wonder, on what level are we talking? I mean, crypto analyzing for me means that you decipher something where something stands for something else in order to understand the message. I mean, if we take that as the way it sounds, in a way, it should be that if you are able to decipher the rock art, a ship should not be seen as a ship but something else, in a way. But I guess that is not the way you are thinking about it.
That is correct, and I'm not thinking of it in that sense. Yeah, I sort of hinted at this concept of when you talked about what level. I said it won't be James gave a seminar today, which that is, when you talk about that is a decipherment.
So
but also, when you say what level,
yeah.
You will recall I said that we will not be able to read rock art in the sense that James gave a seminar today. Not a natural language, not a natural language sentence. It's going to be more abstract, like the last slide, the end slide, where you have, okay, this is at the center, and these things are going around it. So it's more sequence, and that this is the key element, and these are are associated with it, and these are somehow connected to this, and dum 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 dum.
Yeah.
I would not.
I identify relationships between different images. Yeah. I think one things that make me starting to think about it was your use of the word meaning, which I think it's a bit problematic in a way, because if you are because that, I guess that could either indicate a meaningful pattern for us today as researchers to study and understand, but it could of course also imply that you are able to detect a meaning of rock art that was relevant for the people who made the rock art. So I think when you are writing cryptoanalyze the meaning, it gets a bit complicated to understand what you're heading for.
Okay. Okay, and that's a very interesting question. And I'm just, of course, I'm just going to have to scroll to something I prepared earlier.
Yeah.
Because I sort of saw this coming.
Yeah.
Just a little. Okay, hopefully you can see the screen.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, meaning is a problematic concept. You're not the first person to mention that. But again, it's sort of reflecting a little bit on our own cultural things. But you say, can we get a literal meaning? And I prepared that. And this is what I mean about, I don't think I can, no. I don't think it's going to be something we can do maybe now, but in the long term, it is not impossible. And you recall I mentioned in the presentation that our problems are actually much simpler in rock art than they are in the modern signals intelligence landscape. And this, what is on screen now, is the reason I think that. And this quote is also the reason why I think that. And it is, of course, very specific to cryptanalytical applications. But I nonetheless offer it, and I will elaborate on it now. It's from Professor Donald Mickey, and here he is, a little screenshot of him saying it. And the key takeaway is that, for me, where he says, the whole game of cipher design is to design machines which are flawed. They have to be, but in which the flaws are as small and inconspicuous as possible. Now, to me, this means thinking about our solution. We have unlimited guesses. We know we don't think it's random, but we have unlimited guesses. And therefore, we believe that there is a solution. I mean, I think you would agree there is a solution. There is a meaning behind rock art. So if there is a meaning and we have unlimited guesses, some of those guesses...
I don't think I would say that there is a meaning in the sense that there is one meaning.
Meaning can be plural. I mean, it's like Bayesian probability. Many people say that there's only one solution. No, it's only the most likely solution or likely set of solutions. And that, in the words of Jack Good, is the major misconception and mistake people make about it. So the same is true when it comes to meaning. In modern cryptography, for example, one of the strengths is that the key length, the number of characters, means that the number of potentially true combinations is so great that you can't it's hard to guess which one's the right one, because they all can make a natural language sentence. So, of course, in rock art, there's no reason why we can't have several different levels of meaning. And of course, we see that in ethnographic societies. I mean, Johan Ling has written about secret societies and all this sort of thing. But really, it's knowledge control. And when one thinks about knowledge control, I can see no problem to multiple meanings. But I think there is a meaning, and that some of those guesses will be correct. And if we won't, problem is we won't necessarily know when we're right.
Yeah, I think maybe one way of approaching it would be to make a distinction between meaningful patterns that you can identify, and then there is another layer where you can make hypotheses about how these patterns can be interpreted and made meaningful, maybe. Because the way I read your text, I get the impression that you actually think that there is a meaning that you can, by using this method, you can detect it and get an answer that is.
Yeah, I do see that is would be implicit in your in the text, but of course, as you know, you don't have part two, and that's one of the things, including this quote on screen, is what I open with. Yeah, to make this quite clear, this is not what we're going for. Yeah, not what we can expect here.
Exactly. That's a problem I have had. That I don't have part two, but still, I think that the reader will probably read chapter 3 without having. What might read that part first, so it's important that it is clearly stated here as well.
Definitely.
We jump a bit here in the text, and I would like to just discuss a little bit because you mentioned in your presentation that there are different ways of that researchers in the past has tried to explain these patterns that you identify, for example, chronology and identity. And I wonder about the chronology, because I would say that chronology is a factor that can create very strong patterns. I mean, as archaeologists, we're all aware about seriation diagrams, for example, and how objects are produced for a certain period of time, and then they are replaced by other kinds of objects and so on. So moving in time, you will get different kinds of combinations. I mean, also myself, for several years, I was commuting between Lund and Gothenburg. Then I stopped doing that. Now I'm commuting between Lund and Kalmar. So the way we behave as humans are structured, and that will create patterns as well. And how does that relate to your idea about studying rock art as a language?
So,
I mean,
okay,
it could be that you're studying a pattern that is effect of that human behavior is a structured pattern that changes for time. That could be, that would create a structured pattern.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, when I said that chronology is one of the explanations, and then went talking about language, it doesn't mean it's the only one.
No.
Of course, there are diachronic elements, of course. But what cryptanalysis is good is what you then do is you use that to take that as a subset. So you say, okay, we think because of X, Y, and Z, as you say, we know, Peter Skoglund, he has now moved to Kalmar, so therefore we will look at the traffic data between Lund and Kalmar. We won't bother looking how it was to Lund and Göteborg.
Yeah.
It's because if we looked at both of them, we would just be, oh my Lord. I mean, this is what I mean about blur.
Yeah.
So does that answer?
So there will be a kind of traditional analysis of rock art chronology before going into the more semiotic.
And if I may comment on, I mean, I know you yourself have started to look at these questions of the panels. Most applications have so far looked and seen as the panels as, or even have explicitly said, we treat them to be all from one period. And of course that is, oh no, I mean, we can, we can just take out Ane and Kirsten and see, no, this is not the case. Or, we have these different pieces of information and such. Absolutely. So I think, I mean, one of the things Jarl did and emphasized was to focus on time delimited examples. This is a classic thing. This is how Anna Berling came into the T52 traffic. And so did the British. They both got, we definitely know we got all the messages from this day. There's a lot of messages and lots of different, we've got enough material, and let's look at this and just sit there until our eyes go raw.
Yeah.
So for example, Bornholm, I think will become very interesting in the study because we believe it's a time limited example.
Okay.
And therefore we got what's seen as Bornholm's problem is actually a wonderful opportunity, I think. Because particularly with that figurative rock art, okay, we got that right within this period and this, we have this, and this. Okay, and then to take that and then see and look at the patterns in other areas, say Bohuslän or whatever, around Tarnum, and see, we should basically start seeing these sequences and chains appearing.
Yeah. But then I'm a bit relieved because of course that's the basic to solve the chronological changes, and I isolate a phase and then start working with it. That's great. On page 3, you write that the images all once meant something, and the way I read your text, I get the impression that meaning, well, you write that very explicitly, that meaning, that rock art is a kind of language, and I also, the way I read it, that meaning should be able to be expressed by using a language. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I think you need to problematize that a bit, and that is I think a point or an impression I get at many places in your text, that you somehow go very fast into an idea that you like, and then you go into it and you write without taking into consideration that there might be a lot of different kinds of views and also other researchers that has expressed other opinions. I mean, I have a couple of colleagues, for example, in Sweden, some of them working in Stockholm, like Fredrik Wallander, for example, and Magnus Junge, who are not very much into the symbolic aspect of rock art, but they are looking more into the practice of rock art, the making of rock art. A personal example, I mean, I think we are a bit also, we are also quite affected by Australian research, where the people had a lot of stories and myths related to the rock art. But I mean, rock art is a global phenomenon. And there are also examples where rock art is not really something that could be expressed using words or are related to language. For example, I have a friend, Bevestigren, who is traveling a lot in Kenya, where they are still making rock art up in North Kenya. And it's not that complicated. They are making animals like elephants and cows and so on, and inspired by the natural environment. And maybe there was a dangerous elephant, and then they made an image of that and so on, or a cow that they liked very much and so on. So, I mean, there is a big discussion out there by rock art researchers and others stressing other aspects than the symbolic thing. So you will lose a lot of readers when you state that there is a meaning. I mean, you will lose a lot of people that don't agree with you. But if you try to put it in a broader context, you can maybe give them credit, and then you can continue and say, this is the way I think about it, and this is the way I will work. Do you get the point?
I follow, and you see me smiling at many points, and you raise 1, 2, 3, 4. First of all, and I'm going to take each one in turn from the top. First of all, that everything all at once meant something that should be problematized more. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and maybe the problem should come earlier. But what you don't get, and what I basically believe and will say now, and I will say once again at my defense, you know, we work to very strict deadlines, page limits, and constraints in this thesis. This is not like in the old days where you go away, you do it, and it's done, end. So one of the things I think we can learn from cryptanalysts is that it's not about the academically correct answer necessarily. This is the best answer in 4 years. And they often give this example, yeah, well, the best answer in half an hour could be pure gold, but an academically correct answer in 2 hours would be useless. So yes, I totally agree. I go very, very deep, very, very quickly. But we also, if there is any sort of traction at all, and I will expand more, I think it's very interesting with your ethnographic examples, and I'll come to that in a bit. I think that to some extent it is necessary, and I'm absolutely totally aware of the, if you want to call the ignorance or the lack of things like perspectives from Wallander. Very interesting, equally possible. Okay, okay. You know, nobody knows for certain. You know, we just think we know this. But I think, given the limits of this, if I may say, this education, there has to be an element of accepting that. And time and again within cryptology, this has been shown to work. Your gut instinct can sometimes be right. But I think that I do agree on the same time, there needs to be a sort of clarification. This is my position, yeah, and I'm aware of this, and you could look at this, because I also feel that these things, I take Wallander, I mean, he's sort of, yeah, I think it's very, yeah, it's sort of the figurehead. You talk about animism and these sorts of and then we have agency and the and this sort of school as well. They may yet prove, I mean, as I said, we don't know, but at the moment we stand at a very interesting point in terms of technology, science and such, that secrecy is a key theme. A lot of the things I've just presented today have been secret until very recently. I mean, some of the linguistic analysis was declassified on the 2nd of August, 2018. I mean, this is how recent it is. And, and that is considered by the Five Eyes to not be in the public interest, to be in the, but we have these technologies that I think there's an argument for saying, I may not be right, but I think we ought to try because we have the tools now. And that's what I mean about problematizing. I totally agree.
Yeah. I think you are coming here with something very new. And in order to get an acceptance for that, I think, you have to position yourself in a research context a bit more than what you do today. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah, and thanks for that. I think that and it's also interesting to hear that you think that should be there, because I was slightly unsure, is this landing too much on the reader at once? But I would like to also now pick up on your ethnography. And about research story, about okay, and it's how it's dominated, yes. And I thought it was really interesting about Kenya. And when I heard about Kenya, do you know what I thought about? Michael Ventris and Linear B. I haven't discussed him here. He was also helped by, this is why I have it here on my desk, by a certain John Chapwick, who contributes in this edited volume, which is authorized by the security services in 2001, to the decipherment of Linear B. And what they found is actually they were very mundane. So when we talk about meaning, you want to say, I think it may turn out to be exactly that. But of course, imagine if we were studying that phenomena, we would find, okay, there was I picked up, you said, a natural element. There was an angry elephant, angry giraffe or elephant, and therefore we made a carving of it. So the elephant will be the subject, say, and then there will be some, presumably, I'm guessing, some body, God, I only think of the Danish kopstilling at the moment, but body language of the animal that will indicate it's angry. If you follow, I mean, for instance, the horse, its position of its ear.
Maybe, but I'm not sure. I mean, it's the way I understand it, they made it more for fun, and they are inspired by things happening around them in a way. I think you cannot really be sure what inspired the people to do the rock art, and how much of thought they actually put into it. It could very much be that many of these ships we found on the rock art panels are made to remember a ship, or to have fun in a way. It doesn't have to be a lot of meaning related to it.
I completely agree. I'm not saying meaning. I think there's this is what I said about the cultural element. Meaning implies complexity. I do not mean that. Oh, easy here. The two words. But you say more fun and the natural environment. That means if it's the natural environment, there will be a spatial correspondence between the content and the features of the natural environment. And this, in the Cappadocian tablet problem with similarity and difference, will be demonstratable. Do you see what I mean? It's not about thinking about the problem of
it's
some
the pattern.
complex.
It's the patterns that you can study, you can detect them, and you can isolate them. And then at the second level, you can maybe make some hypothesis about how they could be interpreted. Okay. Well, this is another example where you just say something very as a statement, which might be quite unproblematic in a way on page 4, that the goal of archaeology should be to find information about the past. So at the first glance, it could be maybe something that all archaeologists would say is true, but probably not. I have colleagues in Kalmar, for example, who are not that interested in studying the past, but they're most into studying the practice of archaeology. And like my colleague Cornelius Holthoff, for example, And he has argues in several papers that archaeology is the doing, the making of archaeology that is important. There are we have colleagues that are not that much into studying the past. So again, you make a statement which at first glance can be seen as something quite uncomplicated, but there are many layers in those kinds of statements, and I don't really understand if you need them, if they are important for you to make these very explicit statements about what archaeology is and why we should do it and so on. Is that important?
With regard to that specific example, I've thought of withdrawing that particular sense. As you say, you need to go. That's been commented by Jens and Johan also. And but it's interesting. I mean, there is, on the other hand, I completely agree with you. I'm very amazed how other people see archaeology. But for example, I mean, and I don't know whether I have to watch a little bit of what I say here. I think. I mean, I think there's a sort of scale. So there's a big emphasis, of course, rightly on the environment and the like, and the challenges we face. Fair enough. But the environmental question is a political issue in Denmark. So you are effectively politicizing archaeology. Okay, it's for the greater good. But then where do you stop the line? For example, if we look in Catalonia, you're only being allowed to advocate Catalonian identity and separatist identity. That's potentially very dangerous, because then you're identifying somebody as the other. And so that's why I say it should be about the past, because when you start, if you're not careful, I agree you can use it to study the present, but it is very dangerous. And you say about colleagues, but I mean, as I say, I watch what I say, so I will not mention names, but you know, I have heard colleagues who said, I'm very concerned about the way this discourse is going. Yeah, I mean, I sat in a room in a certain place, which I won't name, and they all said, we should completely reorientate.
I think in a way we are, the point here is that it's a big discussion. When you make that kind of definitions or statements, you enter into a big discussion, as we are doing now. And you exclude people, of course. I mean, if you are an archaeologist focusing primarily on archaeology as a practice, as something you do today and so on, that will exclude them from this context, so to say. So it's another example where I question a bit. I mean, because your focus, I think, should be on the methodological parts of this, to really put a bigger focus on explaining why cryptanalysis is useful in relation to rock art. And when you do these kinds of statements, you get away from the what should be your main focus in the text, I think.
Point accepted.
But we can speak a little bit about page 5 and the sun disk. You have this network analysis.
Yep.
You presented it today as well in your presentation. I think I understand your point, but still, I wonder, isn't the outcome quite a lot also decided due to how you define your elements? I mean, for example, you have sun disk, you have concentric circles, and you have crossing circle, for example. How do we know that these three are valid categories, that they cannot be put together in one category, for example? I mean, I get the impression that what you try to demonstrate is that here is a method that will actually demonstrate something very clearly to us. But it boils, again, you have this the assumption, of course, is that the sun disk is a sun, but we don't know, to be honest.
Yeah.
And what is the difference between a sun disk and the concentric circles and the crossing line and so on? Is it, yeah, how do we define them? Why those divisions? Why not something else, and so on?
Well, it links back to Moberg's point. Structures are present in your data from the moment of selection, and also links into work by David Clark, if I'm not mistaken, about how this shapes. Of course, it is a decision, but this, you can't avoid it. And I think, I can't remember whether that is in the text or not. Might have been taken out, but of the draft. But I see. I think as long as you, I mean, what I've tried to do there. I mean, I agree. You could say around the edges, sun horse. That is an interpreted motif, but that is effectively just a label, because we all know that disc connected with our line to this animal figure. That's what it is. It doesn't really matter what you call it. If you want to call it and laden that interpretation, that's your choice. But it's this combination with these elements. Give any meaning or not?
Maybe what I'm thinking here, I'm thinking about that just now when we are talking, is that I think either you accept that the Trundholm chariot is a representation of a horse drawing the sun, or you do not. I'm not sure whether your application here with a network analysis actually would make me change opinion, or anyone else. I don't know. Do you get it? I mean, either you buy it from the very beginning. I'm not sure if you get convinced through your example here.
Yeah, but are we, which I think we're sort of trying to look at two things. The point of the diagram is to show that all those visual elements are connected to each other. Do you disagree with that?
No. I think
there we go then.
Yeah, there is a stronger connection between the concentric circle and the sun horse than it is between the bird and the chariots, for example. Yeah. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's all it is there to prove.
Yeah.
Because that is what the network analysis can do. That is what they said. You're talking about these counts and the frequency of the counts. I mean, so then what happens is, I mean, we can go into this, but the way that is a three-dimensional diagram, and then basically the sums of that mean in linear algebra that the vectors are all going out in one direction. So, I mean, and if you can visually see that you have, say, this disk connected to the line to this horse, of course, the horse and the disk will have a similar count. So that is why they will end up mathematically in the same place. And that's the point, because this is not about the sun.
Maybe it has to for example, the questions you wonder is how many examples is it based on, and so on. And I think there should be a conclusion at the end of 3.5.
Okay.
It's a bit. I think you need to think about it one more time to make it more convincing in a way, so it just not gets an illustration of something that you think is quite obvious. Yeah.
Okay. No, but it's interesting also to hear how another person sees it. I mean, this is very enlightening.
Well, I was just, excuse me. I have to look in my notes. Yeah, I'm still here at page 4 and 5, and I think you probably it's because you make a lot of big statements in the beginning of text. That's why I'm not moving forward. It will go faster later.
I agree. I mean,
I think I will put up my a slide here. I'll try to do that. Yeah. Okay. I was thinking. I think in a way it's a bit of similar to what I've been talking about, but it is about your use of the word truth, which to me I think it's a bit problematic. Maybe you can use it, but I think you have to define it somehow, because in ordinary language it's something. In a philosophy, among philosophers, it's something else. Among social sciences, it's something again different, and so on. So just going out on Wikipedia, you can get a lot of different kinds of definitions and theories on how truth can be explained. I mean, you have like people like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, which were very much into this on how you describe things, that there should be a correspondence between the words you use and the object you try to describe. And then you have mathematics talking about truth in other way. You have, of course, people thinking that truth is a social construction, that those with power have greater influence and can kind of somehow decide what is true. Some people might say that true is whatever is agreed upon. So when you are using the word truth, I spontaneously would think that you will actually be able to be honest, I'm a bit lost. I don't know where you are heading with that word, because to me it's a word loaded with meanings, potentially something very attractive, but also very problematic. So when you're using the word truth, I'm get a bit lost.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, it's very. I've become aware, at least I should say, of that there is some questions about truth. I mean, I sort of gave a selection of quotes in England, and there was uproar. Well, it's not the point of archaeology to say what the truth is. Steady on. I mean, this is not some sort of elitist class war we're dealing with. I mean, as it was basically interpreted there. Suppose maybe it's naive, but I think it's very interesting to see your definitions here, and it's something I know I need to look more into, or at least to define, because I think for me it's much more simple. It's really this business of Mickey, that there has to be, like you said, even if it is we made the carving of a giraffe for fun, that's the meaning, that's the truth, that's the reason why. So truth is just a label we've applied to it.
But in a way, you're using the word to state that it was made by some kind of purpose, and there is a pattern, and you can be able to detect that pattern, and then you will get the truth. But again, I think I'm a bit lost, because the word kind of implies that you also will be able to say the truth meaning of these images for the people who made them. So or
Yeah, I see that. I mean, but I don't,
because if there is an ordered pattern, I wouldn't use the word truth. I think I would say this is a pattern. I can detect it, and here is the data. If you do it as well, that's fine. Well, maybe, yeah. Then well, maybe you can say that's the truth. But in another way, it could also be something else. It could be the true meaning, and so on. So it will make your thoughts and associations go in a lot of different kinds of directions, I think.
Yeah, I mean, what I would ask the question is, if the term is defined early on, do you see it as problematic?
No, I think if you define it early on, you could use it. Yeah, I think so.
I think if you start using all these very complex, long, wordy phrases, I think when it comes to analysis, you will just completely lose your own. You need to have it a bit more concise. But I totally agree it needs to be defined, because it's certainly not meant to be a loaded term. And of course it can be loaded, but I suppose I have not put loading on that. When I read that from the GCHQ mathematician, truth, it can just be anything. It's whatever the hell we're trying to find out, the unknown, or you can have all kinds. It was just,
I would use words like detect patterns and things like that.
Yeah, I think that would be better. Yeah.
I mean, trying to kind of make a distinction between the patterns I'm identifying and perhaps the next step, interpreting those patterns. And
yeah, I mean, or you could
word like truth. It's
well, the truth is both pattern and reality, whereas in fact the two are different. Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah, that be not a way of understanding it, because we're not really going after reality. I mean, like I said, I don't think we can.
No, but you're giving that impression.
Yeah, and that's something.
That impression.
And that should
makes me a bit uneasy with your text. Yeah.
And gets a knee-jerk reaction, and you've lost them, because because that's what, when I first came, I thought reading, and then when I've seen other literature about reading, I've thought, that they're going after this reality. Well, I'm not, I don't believe in that. And I need to distance myself more from that. And I think in some ways that's also been a problem in terms of approaching it, because then if you're not going, if I may say, I've seen all sorts of, for example, reading Vulcan from the perspective of Homer's Odyssey, the Iliad, but in some ways, when you look at the direction, when you look at, say, when they talk about direction and this figure near that, and they're all sailing this way and that way. Now that's what Garden's really talking about, about his semiological classifications. That's not.
I was thinking now while you were talking that maybe, I mean, you have been reading these books about crypto analysis, and much of that was in modern times, from World War II and onwards, where the people analyzing those codes and so on, they could in a way get to a truth, because it was in their contemporary society, though it was people in another country, they could relate to it. But here it becomes different. There is a gap in time, another culture you are studying, a prehistoric culture. So probably there's something there that you have to reflect upon or elaborate.
Yeah, I was aware of this, and I have I can clearly remember writing it somewhere or another in the second part, but I think maybe this needs to be moved forward and linked to the discussion of truth. In the main difference between cryptography, so to say, or cryptanalysts and working in the present, and us and our prehistoric questions, is they get a plain text. They know we got it. I can see, correspondence theory, true statements. If we're trying to hack into this VPN, we'll see a whole lot of nonsense, and then we'll see your text. We know we got the solution, and that's why I talk about knowing about when you're right.
Yeah,
you don't have that sense, and
so in that context, it's probably quite unproblematic. But if you're using the same kinds of words and so on in your logical context, it will get a bit weird almost. A bit. You have to think it through. Yeah.
No, but thanks for that.
Well, James, there is this one big discussion we need to have, and maybe now that it's the time. It's the language. I think we have to talk about the relation between rock art and language. It pops up at several places in your text, right? You already in the beginning you have it on page 5, 6, and then you have it at the end of your text. Well, there is you're not the first one. I mean, other researchers, at least I found one when I was Googling. You might know about her. Geneviève von Petzinger. She has studied Paleolithic art, and not the art we usually think about when we say Paleolithic art, but the abstract Paleolithic art, which actually in many places are close to the animals inside the caves, and she has identified patterns in that abstract art. And she doesn't say it's a language, but she talks about this as a step towards language. And of course she was criticized, because there are no really syntax. There are no systematic repetitions as it is in a syntax and so on. So I mean, of course, people have been thinking about this, although it's not something that has been researched very much in Scandinavian rock art, and probably not in other places as well. But I think I have some difficulties in understanding the argument, and so let's take it from the very basic. I mean, Jarl Nordblad, in his analysis, he defines quite few categories as far as I remember. While, for example, in a language, many languages composed of letters would have about 30 signs, or if it's syllables, they might have 50 and so on. So we're not talking about a direct translation here, that a rock art image would be something like a letter. We're talking about something else, I guess.
Correct.
So what is the syntax? What is the syntax, and what is actually the similarities between rock art and language?
Okay, would you, if I can share my screen, but then you would need to stop because I have a slide prepared. So have you see screen sharing?
Shall I share? I have to. Sorry, I have to.
Yeah, you have to stop.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So, okay. Now, this is very, very, very well. Maybe actually we should start not with that slide, but the next one, because this is key. And you saw this. I went for 2 hours. I mean, Jens knew it was going to be long, but even I was surprised how long it ended up. But I had to call and I had to cut this out. But you've asked, and so you can see it's very important. Now, I'm going to take your points one at a time. For the start, you say there are no systematic repetitions and there are no syntactic structures. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, I was actually referring to the Paleolithic art and the work Jeanette has done, but
Okay.
we can take it from there. I would
Okay,
like
yeah,
to
well,
hear
I've also
your
looked.
arguments. I'm interested in your arguments.
Okay, right, okay, because absolutely, you're right. If there were no repetition and there were no syntactic structures, we'd be in a pretty serious situation here. But there are repeated elements. The fact that you have repeated signs. You often have, say, two signs. Not Mr. Mickey. Yeah, on the same panel. So we got the ships. Yeah. I mean, I think really here about the Wismar horn, but you do have repeats. You do have, and these will and then you go and link to this idea of repeats. You remember I talked about relations and chains or pairs and then chains of relations. These are the basis of syntactic structures. So what you will get, I mean, I didn't put it in, but I realized it. They used to have a thing called rodding, where you had the different alphabets and you slide them up. It's similar to this coincidence of mathematical and physical space. What you would get, what they were looking to do is you would slide the two ciphertexts and look for when the sequence repeated, and that would then give you the connections and the wiring. I mean, I can show you a picture of the tools. I've got it from the Science Museum. I mean, none of them apparently survived the war until magically they appear in 2019. So I imagine with these relations, if you went through, say, a sample and tabulated those, you would start to see these patterns. Jarl goes a little bit along the way, but of course that's at general panel level. It's a bit too coarse. You need to go individually, and I'll show. But to address your point about the number of signs, that is related, and I think this concept really, and it is, I can promise you, key to part two. Code or cipher, because you are talking about cipher. You've already mentioned cipher in your comment, and I'm telling you're thinking of cipher. Cipher is A equals Z, B equals Y. That is a substitution cipher. That's just one way, but it's not the only one. So if you had and when we look at the rock art, if it was a cipher, we would expect the counts and the number and variations of signs to be much more varied than we actually see, even accounting for variations. And this will produce this peak. Now, this is taken from, as it says, genuine German messages by the late Tony Sale, who had a documented securities clearance and was technical chief scientific officer of MI5. This was developed by Sean Wiley into what's called the Sean count. And this is ranked in GCHQ's own words as they only made 4 articles on their site about their history. The founder of GCHQ, Jack Good, told you about him. I can't remember who was Mickey, but anyway, but one of them was Sean, and they talked about this Sean count. And that was only recently that's the only place they talk about it on the internet. But you'd see this sort of, and you notice how punctuation spaces go in one end, and you got these, anyway. Now that's if you got a cipher. Now we look, if it is a code. Now I can show, I don't know, do you know what I mean when I say a code system?
No.
Okay, so then I think I need to find you this. Is this, okay. This is a copy of Allied Naval Cipher number 5, which was cryptanalyzed by the Germans during the Second World War. Now, you can see it's not like a language as we know it. It's these groups of letters, groups of numbers, and you make this index. And remember I talked about redundancy and how you get this top-heavy scenario. You see that on the right?
Yeah.
So in code group systems, it's well known from studies, Friedman, et cetera, that you get, and dare I say it, a certain Swede called Uwe Guldén, who's worked with Berling, that you get this top-heavy structure. So this business, I mean, of course you should look, I mean, in terms of your approach and your workflow, you have to work out, one of the early things you have to look at is code or cipher. So a simple, I'd say simple, but it is relatively simple, a count of you make your divisions. And I think really Jarl's, if you look at Gardan's way of working, you have basic signs and then the subvariants. Even if you take the subvariants, you will probably find that you get certain peaks. I mean, for example, there's a lot which isn't represented in the rock art. If it were truly anything could be represented, say for fun, then I think we would see a much broader variety, because the choice of what could be represented would be not controlled at all. It could be completely up to you, and that is not what we see.
No, of course, it's a very structured and ordered activity. I mean, I guess it boils down to that you have certain combinations that are repeated many times, others that are never really
and he said about
done at all.
Yes, and that is very interesting, and that was very interesting in Jarl's work, because it's not so much about what is there, but what isn't there, and also these combinations. But
still, I mean, I can accept that. I mean, there are very good data to prove that point. But how does that make you think that this has anything to do with language? What is the argument, really? That I mean.
Well, I mean, at the most abstract level, I have to say I don't think it's in the current text, but I have written at some length, I think several paragraphs, if not a couple of pages, where I discuss the concept of studying something as a code or cipher, but without it actually being that. So you could actually study it like a language without it being a language, and I think that is possible. I mean, I've toyed, James, I mean, if that's abstract, I mean, you're somewhere out on the balcony at the moment, you know. So maybe that's an answer to your question. Yeah,
maybe.
And that's another thing. Gardan says you can use these things to study, but they don't have to be language, and it doesn't have to be connected to language. It's just a means of understanding.
And I think maybe that's in a way the key thing with your text, that you have found something here, a methodology that you want to present to the archaeological, to your colleagues in archaeology, in a way.
Correct.
But maybe the text is still reflecting that you have been reading a lot and digesting a lot, and maybe you now have to rewrite it and focus on the methodology. Sorry.
Yeah.
And put more effort and stress into those parts. And to be honest, I would suggest that you cut away lots of the pieces that has to do with people and biographies and who did that and when did he do it and so on. And really more focus on what these people did and why that is relevant to archaeology.
But here we encounter a problem, Peter.
Yeah.
And I've wrestled with this. This is why it came so late, partly. And again, we never know. I mean, if we haven't got the attention of the duty officer at Bude, we never will. Which is where this is going out to America and back, and that's where of course, this will have been flagged. But I wonder whether you would say less of the history. But the problem is that I leave loose ends, and I really know there are certain things which we don't know. You talk about some of these other perspectives. Some of these other perspectives, they don't consider the structurists, this other group, because well, they're communist or or openly such. So of course they're isolated from certain information and collaborations, and If you look at how this picture could look if you removed some documents which were released, you'd have a very different story. And as I said to you about the linguistics, what I haven't touched upon, and thank God I didn't really, is that during the after the Second World War, the NSA devote enormous resources towards the development of a universal cryptanalytical machine to analyze any language. Now, this machine, and you can read this in Burke, this is not classified, that this machine would exploit the properties of language. Now, these generic properties, as I said, this is where the closure of the file, was it HW73 and HW75 in the National Archives, is critical. We cannot read those contents. The smaller, if you like, the subfolders, some little bits were only, as I said, when I first started looking into this in 2018 in an exam, that document was secret. It is against the law. Not only to cite it, but to cite its contents, with or without knowing it can be removed and censored.
I see.
So this is the problem.
It is a very fascinating story. It is interesting what you have found, and parts of it is absolutely relevant. But I think it's quite different from the way you usually structure an archaeological text. Usually you don't write about things through the lenses or through by using different kinds of persons the way you do. Usually you have the problem in focus, and then you make references to different people who has been working with that problem. That's the way I think what you expect when you start to read. And then you enter into this world of crypto, people who have cracked a lot of codes and made big contributions to crypto analyzing. And it gets consequences. Like, for example, the relationship between rock art and language. It's broken up. I think that is something very complicated to understand what you mean and what you want to say. And it's broken up at least in 3 sections now. In the beginning, then page 5, 6, and then the end of the text, which is demanding for the reader. You have to you get bits and pieces, but you never really get the full argument from point 1 to point 5 about the relationship between rock art and language.
But you can't really give that argument without the explanation, because frankly you just end up petering out, well, that's this evidence, and then there's no more. So then we have to go to this person and this person and this, and you could, it's a network analysis. I agree, it is very difficult for the reader to follow. It's even more difficult to try and put it together in an argument that even I can follow. I think I agree, maybe this could receive more focus, this link between rock art and language, but
or maybe you can think about one possibility might be to keep it, but have it as a proper research history, and then half of the text would be more like a research history, and then half of the text would be more like a focus on methods. That's would be one way of moving forward. It is, and it does make it difficult, because also that text where you talk about all these people that has been involved in the business of crypto analyzing these messages, there are a lot of acronyms and place names and names, which also is demanding for someone who is not very familiar with this discussion.
Yeah, and it is very simplified, I can assure you, because a lot of the documents themselves are code named. So of course you need to have knowledge of what that code name means in order to know. So you can have something in the public domain, but you can understand its meaning. But to sort of try and bring back to rock art and language and why,
why,
if I may, because I think this is what lies at the heart of our discussion here. You've read more, and again, I don't really want to put this over the ether with But we know what we're hopefully both talking about. That if this is correct, if they've really come close, if it's really true that there are generic properties of language, the implication is that no known method of communication is secure as long as we use language. And I know I'm not saying the rock art is necessarily language, but we are using words to describe those images, and they must have done something like this in the past, even if it was just to say, this is a giraffe. And that creates the structure. And if they're right from what I'm reading, particularly when we move into the quantum realm, in quantum cryptography and using quantum computers, we are going to be able to consider and exclude a lot of more possibilities than ever been the case. And if they're already able to do that, what I have a sneaking suspicion is that there are things which we're not being told about. And I think that's a problem for me, and maybe that's the problem with the text.
I think maybe that relationship between rock art and language is quite loose. I mean, it's different kinds of media, different kind of expressions. It is very difficult for us also today to categorize rock art, to draw the limits. What is actually a ship and what is not? What is a horse and what is just an animal, and so on. I mean, I think in your what we were just talking about a couple of minutes ago is that you can probably use part of that. Well, you can use structuralism, you can use cryptanalyze methods from cryptanalyze in studying rock art, but you cannot just take it as it is, because it's developed for language, and I think it's problematic to think about rock art as a language. I know you quote Malmer, but that quote doesn't convince me. I mean, I would say rock art is something that could have been done more or less wordless. It doesn't have to be that they were talking about it.
Interesting. I don't know. I suppose this is my theoretical position, so to say, where I find it hard to believe they wouldn't talk about rock art, even if it's only within a certain permitted group. Because the other thing is that if that's true, then it should be more random. It should be more variable.
No, well, it's a structured behavior. They were rules. They were governed by certain facts and rules, and they could, of course, be. But that could be, it doesn't have to be that outspoken either. It could be that when you are at this place, you behave like this. I mean, you enter a church, you know how to behave. It's. I'm not sure if we need language to get that structured pattern. I mean, it is structured. You have something there. And today you can probably also take it, as you say, you can take it further from Nordblad and from Wahlgren and using new documentation, using new data applications and so on. You can take that further, but I'm not so sure. I'm not convinced that there is a very clear relationship between language either today or the language they were spoken in those days. They spoke in those days.
I'm not expecting a transliteration, but I'm thinking. I mean, for me, this is very much, we have the tools. Why don't we give it a try?
Yeah. You can have it. I mean, you could have it as a, well, one is if you need it, but if you think you need it, you can have it as a hypothesis, maybe that there is a relationship. But I'm not sure if you need it. Maybe you can apply the method. Maybe you can get the pattern. maybe you can discuss that pattern without assuming this relationship between language and images, which I think is controversial.
I think the idea of a hypothesis is definitely something that it should be more that, because that is how it is for me. I absolutely do not think that anybody's perspective is less valid. But I do realize, and I hope this is at least clear from the presentation, the audience and the text, that we are in a position we have never had. And I mean, to start looking at this question, I mean, Jarl, he couldn't take it further because he says himself, if I'd had Gephi, I'm sure my PhD would have been on network analysis.
Yeah. So yeah, continue. Go ahead. But yeah, I think because I think you have to consider it, because I think that will be what people will question, or they will you will need to convince people about that relationship, or maybe you can drop it and still do what you intend to do. Maybe you don't need it. You have to think about it.
No, but thank you for raising that. Many of these things, particularly this, is not a question I have not considered or considered uncontroversial. But maybe I've certainly been hesitant in saying, well, why not give it a try? It doesn't sound very scientific, but maybe if you, as you say, it's a hypothesis and this is what, then at least people understand, okay, you're not assuming that that's it and that's the end of it.
But I think my personal choice would be to extract the methods, apply them to the material to detect patterns, and not discuss this as something that has anything to do with language. That would be my choice.
However, I'm not sure whether that would be, whether it would still be possible, because then you could have the criticism, well, you're using language, but you're not commenting on the use of language in something which is not language potentially. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And then you have these links with structuralism and Gardan pretty much being in some form of intelligence work. If he's not in there, he's in the blue, what's called the blue side, the public side.
Yeah, we won't solve it now, but it's something you have to, I think, reflect upon and yeah, this relationship. Yeah, I think I have done my major points, but maybe I could. This is, I know I can make a few more points if we had the time. 10 minutes more or something.
Yeah, it's fine with me.
At the end of the text at page 39, you are commenting upon earlier rock art researchers, and the way you write it, you can get the idea that they were not very much done before 1969. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just having to.
Yeah, in the middle of page 39, up until this point, rock art had mainly been studied and recorded by what were regarded as amateur archaeologists, and that is of course not true. I mean, there were a lot of researchers like Arthur Nordén, Oskar Almgren, Altin, Sverre Mastrander, and so on. Why not Montelius and Hildebrand, working from 1860s onwards in a very scientific tradition? So I think that has to just to be. You have to phrase that in another way.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's seen
things like that you write and then you move ahead and so on. But it's yeah. I mean, since you are so keen in really, you really want to all these people that working with structuralism and cryptanalysis, you want to give them credit. So then you have to give these people working before 1960 some credit as well, or at least not right in that way. I think one thing that maybe I can end with is, which has to do with language in a way, and then I will share my screen here. And it was something that I found quite inspiring. I had not been thinking about rock art in that way, because we tend to think about rock art as something very structured, and I think we are somehow influenced by the way rock art has been recorded and published in printed books. You know, it has become a kind of art. We tend to think about rock art as art. We are detached from the environment, but you are out there in the environment. You are working on the panels. And I mean, as you know, as you know, at the rock art panel, you can move around freely. You can look at rock art from a lot of different perspectives. They are not arranged in a linear sequence. Usually you're not just standing and looking upon them from one perspective, but when you are on the panel, you're moving around. And Liliana Janik, she has written about this, and she is using the idea of station point, which is known in art history. And in traditional paintings, you usually have just one station point. You're looking at the image from a very specific point. You're supposed to stand there to look at the image. But then in later art, like the Cubism and so on, you can get two station points, like this painting here of Henri Matisse, where you can either you have one station point to the left and one to the right. So he composed two station points into the same painting. But in rock art, you have a lot of station points. I mean, you can look up on this from a variety of different angles, right? And Liliana Janik, who published this, and she studied rock art up in Northwest Russia. To her, I mean, rock art became more, I can read it, it became more like a moving image, a moving film. We see and this is the whale hunt. Sorry, this is the whale.
Yeah.
You have the big whale in the middle. You have a lot of ships circulating it, and people working with their harpoons to kill the whale. And we see the whale hunt from a variety of viewpoints. Standing in one place, we are transported to a special place from which we can see the whole story unveiled through the visual narrative. The closest analogy is that of film, and yet the technology of the moving image took a further 5 million to develop. So, I mean, according to her, the thing here is that you are moving around on the panel. You're looking upon it from different perspectives. And that leads me to think about a lot of things. I mean, how do you define relationships when you're not looking into a written text? Where does it start? Where does it end? From where should you look up on it? And to me, that must pose a lot of questions, problems to be tackled, definitions to be made. And how do you make these definitions in order to get your categories and in order to make your associations or non-associations between different images?
Okay, if you, I can answer that, but I will then share my screen.
Yeah.
With reference to Meseberger. So you need to cease sharing your screen and then.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. You see Meseberger?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. I think this is very, I mean, Lily Yannick's points I had certainly come across and read, and was something to consider, but actually she's not not the first. Kalasognis, if I remember correctly, I think he was earlier. I think I've certainly seen something in the 1990s, if not the 1980s from him, looking at Bardal, or maybe even earlier. But I think irrespective, this idea is really interesting because you see these footprints. One of the things that struck me I looked at the direction of the footprints. And I almost thought, well, I mean, one theory, not sure exactly who has proposed it, could be somebody, John Coles or somebody like that, said, well, maybe you stood in somebody's shoes. You stood in the foot soles. I mean, even if whether you had the right size or not, okay. But imagine stand here. You know, you go to the passport gates, you have the 2 foot soles there. You stand there and you look at we understand that. So that could be something. And effectively, I was looking, I mean, starting and stopping. This is a key. And this is where traffic analysis, I think, can really help us. This is what I mean about the message characteristics. Of course, in a key stream, in a stream of continuous text, it's at the beginning or it can be in the middle. But again, because you hide it these days, there are also ways to find it. But let's think of it in imagery. I looked at Meseberger and thought, where could you start? And so I started building the relations. And then I found also in terms of admittedly making assumptions like this cup and ring and this ship and the directions of the ships and started to build these up. And also taking the obvious things that this is at right angles to this one. So quite clearly it's going that way and that one's meant to be going that way. I mean, I hope we don't disagree on that. So then I thought,
with you.
Are these access points? So maybe you can go that way. That was my theory.
Yeah. And then somewhere you have but I guess you also have, if you're working in the tradition of Jarl Nordblad and Wahlgren, you have also defined categories, or?
One more time?
Sorry, you showed Jarl Nordblad's work, his comparison between Bohuslän and Uppland. Is that something you will work with as well, using that?
That I think if I show that, I think that's got to be towards the end. I haven't decided exactly where that should be, but in terms of a general, because with traffic analysis you have different levels. So and you compare for similarity and difference. They had one of the first implementations of the chi-squared test was a machine imaginatively enabled called chi. A large multiplier machine, which allowed them to tell the difference between languages. And that was key in their elements for the NSA, at least, to develop this universal machine to cryptically analyze things. But anyway, effectively, if you did the same thing on that stuff from Uppland, I think you get the same. But what you need to then go into is then also eventually panel for panel detail, because you've got these with Jarl's because
I think what I would have expected something was that you should demonstrate that certain kind of motifs are similar to each other and some are not, or
yeah, I mean, here we go back to our business of classifications, and you being the one as the researcher who selects that, and that will introduce structure, imposed structure, that is, into your data. So similarity is a user-defined concept. I don't think we can, at the basic, if we sort of go to, I'll just go out of screen sharing and then skip forward in in the PowerPoint to yeah, data structures, and then we go to Zoom, and then so we're going to, yeah, this concept of the different levels. Yeah, you've got your classifications coming above your raw data.
Mm.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah. So maybe you have that as a background when you approach the panel, that certain kind of motifs are often combined, and that would make them meaningful in relation to each other, maybe, or something. I don't know.
Do you mean in the past or the present?
Well, I think it all comes down to my question that if you are using if you are using this as a method, I guess you must categorize the images, and you must decide, for example, that if I have a limit of 2 meters, if it's this image number 2 is more than 2 meters away, there is no relationship. Or am I wrong? That was how
that's how Jarl took it, and I think if you just go on a raw proximity, I think that would be very much against the principles of Monsieur Cartan. Yeah. So this is where this central diagram. I mean, you see, it's not. You look at these different kinds of relationships. It's not just about how close they are in spatial proximity. Yeah, you can't have, but you can without sort of. I mean, you're right. You can't go too far away, but then you've got to think about the different kinds. I think it's between to the left, to the right, interlocking, overlapping. That's an obvious combination.
I think in many ways this is something when you're looking at that panel and when you're making these lines and so on. I can say that it's something that I often is struck by when you come to a panel, that you somehow intuitively get the feeling that images relate to each other. And I think the problem which you are now working with is to find some kind of methodology to make those intuitively felt relationships, to be able to detect them and to discuss them in a scientific way, so to say.
Yeah, well, that links to, I mean, this is, and again, apologies for the terrible, this is what you, on the right is what you haven't got. This is the full breakdown and the methodology. So, of course, I haven't managed to digitize this due to being shut out of our offices. But you have levels. It begins with traffic analysis. So this sorting of the categories and such. Look for time-limited examples. So things which say in a grave, or small, which might, look for the pauses. I mean, I think my guess is the pauses are probably the empty space, but I'm not sure, but that should be investigated. Then you go into basically Gardan's various classifications, the topographical, the arrangement, sizes is also important. And there, Philander, I think, has made some very interesting propositions, if I recall. And I think you have also touched on them as well with your work with Ranta et al. And this business of what I call decryption, and you please note it's in parentheses here, but this is if we were in Arlington Hall, Virginia, we would be saying, okay, folks, this is the bit where we get the end product out. And then here I talked about the code or cipher, you code book, code groups, dum. And then you also look for toe holds, or what they call toe holds. So repeated elements and depths, which you've brought up already in your, I mean, if we basically Ventris, Linear B, or the Great Decipherments, hieroglyphics, they all used well-known text. So they got Cleopatra as the pharaoh. So then they were able to use that and work from there. I mean, this was version, I think, 1. a little experiment on a panel, and this is strongly influenced by my time digging with our wonderful host, Mr. Andreasen, on Bornholm at Sortemul, to take a sort of an instance where unique IDs for each of the figures, and then record. Sorry, I need to. The unique IDs for each of the figures, and then record their relationships. Now, I accept it can be problematic, but for instance, I would not say, I'd have to look in the data. I have not put a relationship between this and this, although if we're using Gardan's system, we would then say that all these and all these and all their contents, there is some relationship intersecting with this going around, which is the curve of a rock. But you can see even more, which we haven't painted due to the weathering of the surface. You see, you've got these figures inside the ships. I mean, I hope people wouldn't disagree. You've got these elements inside these vessels. Certainly here they seem related. We can discuss with the superimpositions that some of them are not. And there you get this, when you have this, so to say, overcarving, or what we call superimposition, then you would say there's a superimposition, and you classify it as superimposition. Okay, this is just being carved over the top. This is not something to do with it. But then again, you could argue, look at how you got these figures, and then they go across, and then they go here. So are they going from this boat to that boat? Maybe you've got to record all these and then work, as Moberg beautifully puts it, plow and harrow your finds and attributes matrix backward and forward. And the way to take this to version 2, basically Jens saw this and said, I will give you this. He was key instigator. He's very modest, Jens, about the having the idea of different tables. So to say, if you like, the figure is a table, the panel is a table, the area can all be a table, and these tables all link. And now I've been made aware of that. I think even if I can't do it, maybe I can do a small test, maybe with this panel would be a lovely example. But that's the way I go, or we should go eventually.
Okay, Jens, I think maybe the time has come to kind of wrap it up and summarize a bit. I think what I appreciate with your text and what I like is that you go outside the box. You look for a new inspiration to address traditional archaeological problems, and that is really inspiring in many ways. I have been focusing on chapter 3, and that's of course a big difficulty because I don't have part 2 where you put this into motion, where you actually work with the tools you now present. But if I should summarize my impressions of chapter 3, I think one thing you should think about is the style and how you structure the text. I mean, it is important with coherence in a scientific text. And I think that this way of approaching this theme through these various researchers in a biographical way, it breaks up the text in various pieces and make it difficult to read. I lost myself several times. So maybe, as we were talking about, one way forward would be to more focus on research history on one side and methodology on the other side. And I think the relationship between rock art and language, this is my second point, has to be elaborated. I would prefer to gather that discussion at one place and try to really address it from the beginning to the end, so to say. What are the arguments? How can we think about this? Is there a relationship or is there not? Can we use the method even though there is not a relationship between images and language. And then, as I said, you should, as a third point, you should reflect, you should maybe think a little bit of how you write the text. You don't have to make judgment on everything or have an opinion on everything. I mean, what is archaeology is a very big question, for example, and what archaeologists should do. We have been talking about the use of the word truth, the use of the word meaning, and so on. I mean, try to address that differently, because some of it you don't need, other things you have to define or make a broader and deeper discussion with more references to make people aware of that you know about the discussion and so on. And then at the end, I think I try to enter this discussion with categorization and how you define things. And I understand that you have a lot of things in the pipeline, so to say, and you have been thinking a lot about these issues. So maybe it isn't a problem, but you understand my worry is that rock art is in very much an anarchistic medium. It's on the panels. You are. It's kind of unstructured. Even I know you will argue for the opposite, but I think you can see it as something that is. I think I often think in terms of media, in different kinds of media. I mean, going out on the panels, kneeling down on them, walking around, seeing things from different perspectives. It's a very different experience than writing a book or decoding a message in an office. Yeah. So yeah. So I'm looking forward to read more about your results and how this will be implemented and what will come out of it. Yeah. So yeah, that was my thoughts.
Well, thank you very much for your thoughts and all your input. I mean, really useful, and yeah, it's a privilege to have a mirror held up, so to say, and when you are working with something, and to hear, and as you can tell, some things you have completely you don't think, haven't even thought of, and others actually have been there, and yeah, I mean, I really like that little idea. You just said media and different experience. That's something we definitely need to think more about. I mean, at the moment, I'm just taking one level at a time. Otherwise, the head will just sort of explode, I think, sometimes. But that's something that is important. And yeah, but
yeah.
This is not going to be solved overnight. This is just the beginning, and then yeah, then we there's a long way to go, and maybe I wouldn't expect at all that I'm the one that takes it the whole way.
No, but your work will be important. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting discussion, which also I must say extended a little bit over our time. And I can see we have 15 brave attendants, and I mean, respect for this persistence. So I posted out that there was a possibility to put questions forward to you, and there are 2 questions. So
Go ahead.
yeah, so Johan Larsen asks to James, how do you deal with the potential regional differences in taphonomy? Denmark has been lacking stone in the medieval period and hence might have repurposed stones. And he continues, just to a greater degree than, for instance, Sweden, where they have stone, question mark. For instance, some types of carvings may be missing to a greater degree in some areas. if their medium, in quotes, is was later on desirable. So this is well, not a question of recovery, but of the, let's say, formation process of our archaeological record. So yeah, it's a bit out of line what you have been talking to, but okay, so go for it.
I actually would disagree. I think it is a pivotal question, but one I was only able to briefly touch on. And to sort of answer this, I will refer to a recent discovery made last year on Bornholm. I absolutely agree. There are enormous biases in the way material has been preserved, and I think this is where it comes. It's a challenge, but it's also an advantage. You have to be aware that on the one hand, we could be missing something. We may not know what we're missing, but then you've got to think of what the sample which is preserved, that we are sampling that sample. Now, how does this work in practice? What you see here will be appearing in the next issue of Adoranten. But it's the first instance of figurative rock art known on Bornholm carved on a vertical surface. Since 1888, the axiom that things are found when it comes to figurative rock art on the top, on sloping surfaces of outcrops has been dominant. However, the discoveries by Gerhard Milstroy and myself suggest this has to be challenged. And this is sort of basically suggest we on Bornholm, for example, we knew it was on stones. Okay, we know it's on stones. We make a map of the ones on stones in Oostermarie, in East Bornholm. Okay, number two, we find a stone carver from Bohuslän notices some ship carvings at Blåhud. Okay, okay, so it's on the top of these outcrops. And then we come to this. So we've been potentially what we thought when we thought we were looking at a sample which has been denuded by quarrying or just simply not known, and it's on the top. We've effectively potentially been only looking at that sample, the sample of the ones on the top, and there's still all those ones on the side. And of course, to get at those, these are buried. Here, the owner had done excavation and landscape gardening, so they were discovered. But in a farmland situation, this would not be the case. So I think one just needs to bear in mind that to think about, okay, it's a sample that I'm studying, and to make that also clear in your research. So maybe if it's carved for fun or carved for whatever reason, I would expect that the patterns reflect that. So that's my my response. I don't know whether Peter, perhaps you have a.
No comment on that.
Okay.
Okay, and then Reinz A. I don't know who that is. Right, just a question for later. I have to leave now, blah, 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 blah. How far have you taken into consideration iconological or compositional approaches?
I was about to say is this, I would always ask the question back, is this iconoclasm or sort of these symbols as icons? And what was the second part? Refresh my memory.
Compositional approaches.
Okay. So when we come to compositional approaches, that I think one can, I can certainly give an answer first. So when it comes to compositions, I mentioned on Bornholm that we assume, for reasons of images on the razors found in datable contexts, that the carvings of Bornholm are all more or less of the same period. So when you have things which look very, symbols or signs which look very similar, then you have the potential to start understanding compositions. And I think this is where, as I said, Bornholm could be very interesting. And although some of these images here are later during the Iron Age, the main majority of the so this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one are of a similar, probably of a similar sort of period. So if you like, the compositional element can be studied by studying that subset, if that gives any meaning, and how that relates to each other. As to icons, if we're talking of iconoclasm, we don't see obliteration such as we see.
No, sorry, he says iconological. I don't know what that is, but that's what.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what that is.
Maybe I just have to look that up. Look at just briefly. Iconological.
Yeah.
Forgive my ignorance already here. This is obviously a good question because iconology. And I see Panofsky here. Iconology is a method of, this is from Wikipedia, iconology is a method of interpretation in cultural history and the history of visual arts used by A.B. Warburg, Owen Panofsky, and their followers that uncovers the cultural, social, and historical background of themes and subjects in visual arts. So trying to understand the concepts so that I can best answer the particular question. So, for example, in contrast to iconography, I mean, this business with Panofsky, this is something I noticed. Panofsky is someone that I think Jan Nordblatt and certainly Jean-Claude Gardin discusses in his semiologic, his discussion on semiotics in archaeology. So iconography, a known principle in the known world. Iconology is an iconography turned interpretive. So, well, presumably, if the icons are a means of interpreting whatever it is, I mean, is this really not a discussion, so to say, about where we were having about meaning?
Maybe. I'm getting tired and it's late in the day. I just know that Panofsky is a great figure in art history, and I think he had some, he proposed some working tools on how to interpret art, you should start from the basic, kind of identify the basic features and then move on to more complex interpretations. But it's not my piece of cake, really.
Yeah, and that would explain the connection with Gardin, because I think maybe the reference is there in breaking down into minimum component levels. So here I will share my screen. Internet access provided by.
Yeah, but James.
Okay.
Peter is
dead.
Tired, and
okay.
And we have 12.
We're losing people.
Yeah, we are losing people, and So I will then say many thanks to Peter and James, and you can. I mean, I can't invite for a dinner, which we normally would do. But what you can do, if there are topics you want to expand on, once you have, let's say, digested all your discussions here, then you could move back and make a private dialogue via Zoom,
Yeah.
and then maybe maybe continue the talks here. I have done different notes for my supervision on this. So thank you very.
I think that's a very good suggestion, that some kind of post seminar between the two of us or the three of us. We arranged that through Zoom or email or something to just in a more private, informal way.
Yeah.
Exchange some thoughts. And I maybe can send you some notes from me as well that I made during my reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so I will stop the